you're excavating these graves, because you really don't want to be getting into a situation where there is a question mark, even down to whether you're even dealing with the right body. We were lucky from that point of view that the top coffin was intact, so we knew there wasn't going to be any of what we call the commingling of remains. His coffin was fairly intact too, so again, there wasn't any possibility of someone saying, "What happens if it's the body below?" or something like that. These are all things you have to be aware of, and that was my role, to make sure wherever samples were taken, there couldn't be a question mark over where it came from or who it came from. Francisco Garcia. I wanted to ask something else. It's a more general question, and it might sound stupid. Would you have been aware of Bible John when you were growing up in Glasgow? Marie Casti. Oh, yeah. I mean, think about it. There's not that many serial killers in the Glasgow and Strathclyde area. There was that guy before Bible John. What was his name? Francisco Garcia. Peter Manuel. Marie Casti. Yeah. I mean, we knew of Bible John, but I didn't know the ins and outs of it. I didn't know much about the background of the women who were supposed to have been killed by this Bible John. But we did know that there had been several women who had been killed by a man. So, yes, we knew about it. But did we pay much heed? No, not really. I can't say I lost sleep over it as a teenager going into the centre of Glasgow. In my day, it was discotheques. It never really crossed my mind that I'd come across this figure who would come and do me harm. As far as I was concerned, that was the past anyway. Francisco Garcia. There were so many people who became associated with the case. This gallery of terrible killers who people were so determined to fit into the Bible John story. Peter Manuel and so many others. But even now the mystery persists. Do you remember much about the media coverage after the exhumation, and what happened when it was increasingly clear that the legend hadn't been solved at all? Marie Casti. To be honest, not really. It was one of those things. Maybe because it was an old case, or a cold case, I suppose, where, well, Glasgow was always so full and busy with warm cases. It was around that time, in the mid-1990s, that it started becoming known as the murder capital. We were extremely busy with all of these cases. The exhumation and Bible John were just more things I didn't have time to dwell on. The murders kept coming in. Glasgow has gone through waves of activity. It had been the European City of Culture in 1990, and you were meant to think that everything was lovely and rosy. But if you look at the homicide figures, we were extremely busy. And so McInnes was just a cold case. It wasn't something that I was going to have any other input into, other than to say, yes, I was there, and yes, I oversaw the excavation. I retrieved the bone that was sent for DNA analysis. There were other people there who were involved, and who were also there to make sure everything was done by the book. We had to call in the dentist, who was going to look at McInnes because Bible John had allegedly left a bite mark on one of the women. Again, I had nothing to do with any of that. That was somebody else, another expert coming in to oversee that part of things. Francisco Garcia. There was always violence and murder for you to attend to. And at root, these were murders like any other. But then again, I suppose that isn't really entirely true because Bible John had become this mythical entity by that point. In fact, that had been the case for a very long time, even by 1996. Marie Casti. People like to big up their part in it all. They like to think that they were the most important person, that they were the most important person involved in it. Unfortunately, people do embellish things, you know, a great deal. I don't come from that school of forensic pathology. I just say, look, this is the limit of my expertise, and that there's a lot of other clever people doing a lot of clever things, and I'm quite happy to bow to other people's expertise. I really don't have a problem with that at all. Francisco Garcia. And there are limits to this, right? That the science is such a gift and such an immensely valuable tool. But it isn't some kind of strange and infallible magic. It's not like the kind of thing seen on TV or in films, where the scientists show up to the murder scene and wave a wand about until they spot a neatly packaged little pool of the killer's DNA on a door handle or something. Marie Casti. I think that's maybe some of the problem. That people get an idea of someone's role from how things are represented in films and television programs. You know, it can't just be a pathologist. They have to be a scientist as well. They have to be the police officer too. They have to play these multiple roles to make that story work. Whereas, the sad fact of life is that there are lots and lots of people involved in every case, and we all do our own little bit. And then, hopefully, someone is able to put the jigsaw together and make the fuller picture. So maybe in the olden days there might have been sort of half a dozen experts. But today, that number is up in the hundreds. The sad fact is that people don't appreciate that. I'd visited Lamhill Cemetery a few months before my dismal search for John McInnes in Stonehouse. There was a very different kind of day breaking when I set off from my battered B&B at the top of Garnet Hill, a few yards from the Glasgow School of Art. A crisp November morning which spread out under a bright grey sky that seemed to promise frost rather than rain. My phone told me it would take just under an hour and a half to drift up on foot through Maryhill and beyond, right up to the stolid Victorian cemetery where Helen Puttock had been buried in 1969. The canal pathway up to Maryhill Locks was dotted with cyclists and Saturday morning walkers wrapped in fleeces and sturdy waterproofs. Children stared into the mucky, dark blue water, or clasped their parents' hands in silence. At one point, the path became blocked by a fence next to a reinforced plywood board emblazoned with a notice for the housing developer Balfour Beatty. The "No Access for Unauthorised Persons" sign was scrawled over with thick black permanent marker. "Know your worth," read the gnomic new proclamation. It was still bright by the time I arrived at the front gate of the cemetery. This was the first time I'd met Audrey Gillen, though we'd spoken on the phone for a while a few months before. The former Guardian reporter had made contact the previous summer, having become aware that I was writing this book through a mutual friend of ours. Few people or journalists know the ins and outs of the Bible John saga as well as Gillen, who had broken the story of McInnes's identity as a young reporter back in the mid-1990s. Almost quarter of a century on, she'd recently started working on her own new project, a podcast re-examining her connection to Bible John and the McInnes scoop that had caused such consternation and excitement in the Scottish press. The afternoon sun was already starting to weaken when we met by a cluster of graves at the north end of the cemetery. To the northwest lay the Campsies, the range of gentle rolling hills slightly obscured by a row of low red brick houses in the more immediate foreground. As we began to chat, our feet angled away from the main path to a place where the ground was firm and slightly spongy underfoot. Our phone screens both showed the same image, the photo of George Puttock kneeling beside Helen Puttock's grave in early 1996. An hour passed as we tried to orientate ourselves using the position of the snow-covered hills in the background. We walked up and down several rows of neat and well-tended graves with little success. Perhaps the newish-looking houses to our left were a red herring that had thrown us off. Or maybe we weren't even in the right section of the cemetery at all. These, and many other justifications, started to feel increasingly seductive as the sun began to set and the cold to descend in earnest. After another quarter of an hour or so of fruitless searching, we made the decision to call it a night and acknowledge something to ourselves. that we just weren't going to find Helen Puttock that day. On the walk back to Maryhill, we spoke about Bible John and a couple of the more outlandish figures and theories surrounding the mythology. Talking with Audrey immediately felt like a return to dry land. After a couple of months spent splashing in the deep, strange waters of often addled speculation. She was funny, dry, and precisely to the point on the things she knew and the other things she didn't. Back at the flat she'd been staying in, we settled down to some dinner and let the conversation drift to other topics. It was around 7 when I left to meet some friends at a pub in the West End. It already felt like a long day, and I was starting to feel tired, and had to strain a bit to watch my footing on the slick ice underfoot, which had silently spread across the city in the time I'd been inside. I wondered what would have happened if the afternoon had played out differently. If we'd found Helen Puttock's grave rather than abandoning the search as the dark drew in. Before setting out that morning, I suppose I'd have dignified the search by explaining that it had something to do with respect for the woman whose murder I'd already spent so much time reading and writing about. That it would be a recognition of her and the reality of the crimes which had so long ago been swallowed up and digested into urban folklore. Perhaps, I thought, there was something fitting in my inability to locate her gravesite. Just another false start to add to the growing collection, and another way in which the facts of the past refused to conform to the desires of the present. Another layer of unreality to pull tight and close over all the other failures that had gone before. Chapter 11. The Play. I first came across Paul Harrison in the summer of 2018. It was early on in my initial reporting, at that frenetic period in the process of putting together any story when every new lead feels brilliantly alive with possibility, or at least a certain enjoyable novelty. When the rapidly accumulating pile of books and papers might occasionally strike me as a hearty challenge rather than a bitter endurance test. It is often a greedy period, whatever the subject matter. Greed for material and greed for other people's time. I can recall ordering every book I could find that made even cursory mention of Bible John, however surreal their angle, or whatever their reviews might have warned. The paperbacks kept arriving during those weeks, some brand new and others battered with age or yellowed from second-hand cigarette smoke. These reeking little monuments to another person's dormant or long-forgotten obsession were the ones I tended to enjoy the best. I'd sent emails and Facebook message requests with what I liked to think was remorseless diligence to academics and ex-police officers who would have well remembered Bible John and Joe Beattie's crusade to catch the killer. Some of these messages were answered, and many others ignored. One prompt reply, perhaps the promptest, had come from Paul Harrison, author of Dancing with the Devil, The Bible John Murders, which had been released by an obscure publisher in 2013 to a few polite notices in the Scottish press. The Daily Record had briefly covered the book and its incendiary central claim, that the mythical Bible John was an unnamed Glaswegian police officer, now long retired and living in a remote corner of the Highlands. This was no wild accusation designed to drum up anything as vulgar as a few cheap headlines. Harrison, a prolific and moderately successful true crime writer, as well as a vastly decorated former police officer, explained to the paper how he'd spent years researching the case, which he'd never quite been able to shake. His reporting had run deep, far deeper than the dilettantes who had gone before, who had simply repeated the same old lazy assumptions and pointed to the same threadbare gallery of implausible or debunked leading suspects. It was, he writes in the book's introduction, a long, often dangerous journey, and I have used every ounce of my investigative training and skills to delve into the matter. But Strathclyde police hadn't wanted to know about the results of Harrison's investigation. Instead, he had been met with an orchestrated campaign of silence and hostility from Scotland's largest and most notorious police force. Perhaps most impressively of all, he had managed to befriend and extensively interview both Joe Beattie and Jeannie Williams before their deaths in 2000 and 2010, respectively. Though Beattie wasn't in the best of health, he had taken a liking to Harrison, and the two had met many times over the years. The same was true of his relationship with Jeannie Williams, who he refers to as Jeannie McLachlan. Though it was hard for Beattie to hear the mass of evidence against one of his own, it hadn't come as the most terrible or unseen of surprises. In Harrison's telling, it was Beattie's own belated suspicions against his fellow officers back in the early 1970s that had seen the inquiry dismantled. Harrison traces a vast and subtle conspiracy that culminated with Bible John slipping through the net. A plot which originated at and spread across the most senior levels of Glasgow's police force. All of this makes for compelling reading, despite Harrison's scattergun prose. Though perhaps this is a churlish gripe, considering the book's explosive content. Harrison explains how Jeannie Williams had told him that she'd seen the killer during one of the innumerable visits she'd made to the Marine. Having pointed at the man, Beattie had immediately dismissed it out of hand, as she'd gestured at one of his own detectives. Despite compiling an inches-thick dossier of research, Harrison thought it strange that the police had never responded to his earnest offers of help, considering his own uniquely garlanded career, including stints as an undercover football hooligan and a Royal Protection Officer, and his status as the youngest sergeant in British policing history. Most impressively, Harrison was also one of the first figures from British law enforcement to train at the FBI's legendary Behavioural Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia. And he was more than happy to use some of his carefully sharpened investigative prowess to profile Bible John. The killer would now be a married man with children and strong links to religion. Most chillingly of all, it was almost certain that he wouldn't have stopped killing in 1969. It was a matter of urgency, Harrison told reporters, to investigate several open murder case files across the Highlands. The man he believed to be Bible John had moved there soon after taking early retirement in the early 1970s. Only legal restraints were stopping Harrison from naming the killer, though he was still waiting with forlorn patience for the police to make contact and collaborate with his investigation. What he wanted most of all, he told the Daily Record, was justice for the families of the women he killed, and for Joe Beattie. He was a brilliant detective who wouldn't accept that he couldn't close that case. I'd read Dancing with the Devil in 2 or 3 delighted sittings, punctured by bouts of increasingly wide-eyed astonishment. It was hard to know precisely what to make of it. Clearly Harrison had committed to his research. There were a few interesting factual points made about Glasgow in the 1960s, and the ways it did and didn't change throughout the course of the decade. Its violence and its portrayal in the papers of the day. Mostly, it was impossible not to be struck by the book's incredible levels of access to the most important figures at the heart of the Bible John saga, ranging from several famously taciturn real-life characters to a cluster of alarmingly eloquent unnamed sources. Both Jeannie Williams and Joe Beattie lapse into paragraph and sometimes page-long soliloquies, which remarkably always seemed to exactly confirm Harrison's own hypothesis. Here is his Jeannie Williams on the suspicion she'd felt radiating from many of the officers and detectives from the Marine. There was animosity against me, especially when Joe had officers moved off the inquiry because of issues of trust. I never fully knew what he meant, but I did know that he believed that too much gossip and information was being leaked out from the investigation to the press and elsewhere. It didn't help that I felt concerned about the way some of the officers were speaking and treating me. More than once I was referred to as a prostitute, and others would ask what I was doing later, inviting me out for a drink and a bit of fun. That wasn't me at all. I wasn't like that. It really hurt that I lost my sister to a murderer, yet some police thought it was okay to put me down and dismiss me as though I was a worthless drunk who had manipulated a situation for my own needs. This sort of thing goes on for a number of paragraphs, before eventually petering out. As soon as I'd finished the book, I knew I had to speak with Harrison, the distinguished profiler and the confidant of Joe Beattie's last years. In June 2018, we'd exchanged a brief flurry of emails. I was keen to speak about his remarkable book, whenever he might have a minute. Our diaries never did manage to align that summer. Harrison told me he was writing a feature of his own and was in the middle of a serial killer speaking tour across the UK, though he assured me he'd email to discuss more on his return home. No message ever arrived. I soon forgot about our brief exchange. My original piece on Bible John was filed and life moved on. It was just over a year later when the first news reports broke in the national press, illustrated by pictures of a familiar-looking middle-aged man in rimmed glasses and a loud tartan waistcoat. There was sadly one major issue with Paul Harrison, esteemed true crime writer, criminal profiler and Bible John authority. He had made almost everything up, from the pages of his titanic bibliography right through to the contents of his glittering and pages-long CV. Britain's self-appointed serial killer hunter had been outed as a fraud of astonishing longevity and brazenness. The collapse of his intricate, if not particularly guileful web of falsehoods was as sudden as it was total. A journalist from The Sun had attended one of Harrison's sold-out talks at a theatre in Newcastle and was instantly transfixed by the stream of fantastical nonsense pouring out of the middle-aged Cumbrian on stage. None of the subsequently published revelations came as much of a surprise after reading his contribution to the Bible John cottage industry. No, the FBI hadn't invited a low-ranking and undistinguished police officer to train at Quantico. Among the wreckage of his persona was one verifiable fact. Harrison had indeed pounded pavements in Kettering for a brief period in the 1990s. No, Peter Sutcliffe had never expressed terror in Harrison's presence. The story had been repeated so often on stage that word had even reached the killer in the high-security confines of HMP Frankland. And there was no verifiable suggestion that he'd ever so much as exchanged messages with either Joe Beattie or Jeannie Williams. His latest book was immediately pulled from sale, and Harrison was sufficiently cowed to publish a brief and rapidly deleted apology on his Facebook page, which blamed his publishers and several other dark forces for the series of uncovered embellishments and sensational claims. While Bible John was little more than a footnote in Paul Harrison's private solar system of deceit, the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to make its own kind of lopsided sense. By 2013, the facts of the story as they were had long ago receded into the past. I thought of the news stories published to herald Harrison's Bible John book and the evident absurdities spelled out so vividly on almost every page. For the papers that ran them, it didn't strike me as an especially complicated decision to have taken. Even then, a cursory mention of Bible John would provoke a reliable spike in eyeballs visiting their websites, particularly when that mention came wrapped in a sensational new theory regarding a high-level and long-hushed-up conspiracy at the very top of Glasgow's notoriously clannish and insular police force. As theories go, the broad outline to it wasn't the most crankish. with police corruption and violence hardly novelties in Glasgow or elsewhere across the UK. It continued to fascinate and amuse me that Harrison at least had the confidence trickster's good sense to lay down a vaguely solid structural foundation before adding the alarming rococo flourishes, like the ridiculously long and histrionic speeches delivered by Joe Beatty and Jeannie Williams, and the enjoyably eggy cliché of the devilish uncaught killer living in a remote corner of the Highlands. Of course, Harrison couldn't resist adding that he would have killed again. In his own more willfully extreme way, Paul Harrison was simply continuing a long tradition laid down over the decades that had seen the creation of the Bible John myth. The tradition of increasingly turbocharged and nonsensical theories that had only ever served to obscure the facts surrounding the three killings, which no one could apparently say with any certainty had even been committed by the same figure. The more I revisited his book, the more I grew to enjoy it in a way. Its very dishonesty and ridiculousness, carried to ever more airless and disorientating heights. The strange book could be guiltily delighted in, as long as you chose to read it as what it was, an absurdist text. Harrison had lied and deceived to an almost obsessive degree. It was craven and retrospectively embarrassing, though not entirely devoid of a specific strain of gallows humour. This couldn't be said for some of the more serious and straight-laced alternatives. From the very start, Bible John was a magnet for the most naked and unapologetic ambition. Joe Beatty's was perhaps the first example, even if no one could fault his earnestness, or has really managed or wanted to do so in the decades since. Though he was fatally stubborn and inflexible, few have ever doubted his deep personal connection to the case through his close affiliation with Jeannie Williams, his investigative muse. After he died in 2000, aged 82, the obituaries were as much devoted to Bible John as they were to the rest of Beatty's life and career. Whenever the case resurfaced in the press towards the end of his life, he had given a very different take to when the hysteria had been at its height in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When the McInnes news was dominating headlines in 1996, it was Beatty, now the wise elder statesman and monument to a very different time and place, who was quoted pouring cold water on the idea of a serial killer. But that hadn't quite been the case when he'd been running the investigation at the height of his power and authority. Though no one person could be blamed for the desperately dysfunctional and chaotic early inquiry, riven with incompetence and casual misogyny, Beatty's dominant role could hardly be ignored. To many observers at the time, it felt like Mr. Beatty might know only too well the opportunity that Bible John represented, the chance to transform himself into a legend. Of all the sources that I'd come across, few were and have ended up being as useful as Alan Crowe and Peter Sampson's 1998 book, Bible John, Hunt for a Killer. Its pages contain unparalleled detail on the weird, strained life of John McInnes and his brief afterlife as a cause célèbre in the Scottish press. It also read like what it is, a book produced in a manic flush of activity after the first revelations had broken in late 1995. The chronology is fragmented, diving between the late 1960s and the then present day. The two journalists worked at the Daily Record's sister publication, the Sunday Mail, and some of the book's content was taken from the initial news reports surrounding the exhumation that I'd read on my back office perch in the Daily Record building. Like so many other journalists of the day, they'd hedged their bets that McInnes was Bible John. There are several sections that show the signs of hasty revision when it had become apparent McInnes probably wasn't the mythical serial killer at all. When I spoke with Peter Sampson over the phone in early May 2022, he told me he'd attended the exhumation, or rather, observed from afar. He and Crow were then locked in a room for several weeks to write the book. Being staffers, there was no extra financial recompense attached to the project. It was just part and parcel of their everyday duties, he told me. The two were also working on a book about the 1996 Dunblane massacre, told through the lens of several of the victims' surviving families and loved ones. It was an intense time, he explained, with a fair hint of understatement. Samson could still remember the morning of the McInnes exhumation fairly clearly. It was hard to forget, really, he said. Then, as now, he wouldn't have exactly styled himself as a big fan of graveyards. Indeed, lurking around a cemetery isn't something he'd ever choose as a hobby. He's pretty sure that he can recall a bright sunny morning, very bright, with a clear blue sky above that seemed to accentuate the enormity of what was happening in front of him. Something about the idea of an exhumation still catches him hard to this day. It must be the most enormous decision to make, not just for the families of those that are left behind, but even for the authorities. It must be, he explained, like opening Pandora's box. Seeing it was quite chilling, as there were the tents covering the grave. It was a big operation for what was essentially a 6x2 hole in the ground. It was busy, he remembered, with police and white suits swarming everywhere. A silent hive of activity. He can still remember the quiet. If you were blind, he told me, you still wouldn't have heard a pin drop. When I asked what it felt like when the inconclusive results of the DNA testing came through, Samson is clear enough. He couldn't even remember what day it was, though it was likely a Thursday or Friday when he heard the news. All the daily papers were going to have the story, but it had all been so long ago it was hard to recall with any certainty. It was 1996, and that's 26 years ago. I struggle sometimes to remember what happened 26 minutes ago. It's like a different life when I look back at it, you know? After our call, I'd emailed Alan Crowe, as I wanted to hear his recollections of the time, and whether he'd continued to grip onto the Bible John story, while his co-author had clearly moved on. Despite sending several interview requests into the ether, I never did hear back from the former deputy news editor at the Sunday Mail. A week before my call with Peter Samson, I'd taken the train from Glasgow Central to Lanark, a journey which takes an hour or so to drift pleasantly south through a succession of unglamorous outer suburbs and mid-sized satellite towns, from Cambuslang and Uddingston to Motherwell, Wishaw and beyond. On a bright Thursday evening in late April, it felt like good luck to catch the journey at its most picturesque. The train was busy with the gentle hum of the daily commuter crowd, whose numbers gradually thinned out as the train progressed along the line. On arrival, I took in the High Street before doubling back on myself and arriving at Lanark Memorial Hall. Dancing with the Devil was already well into its run across Lanarkshire and beyond. The press coverage had been positive, if fairly light on detail. I'd been intrigued from the moment I'd seen a notice appear for it on the Daily Record website. It wasn't every day that came with the offer of a dramatic musical take on the killings. 1968. Glasgow's dance halls jiving and swinging to the sounds of the 60s. Gangs on street corners. The Clyde launching her last ships. Fashions taking on a new flair. But Glasgow loves to dance. Its dance floors beating to a Fab Four and more. Remember the Pally, the Plaza, the Locarno. But the Barrowlands was rife. Rife with rhythm, rife with rumour. Lurking in its smoky shadows was a serial killer. Murder on and off the dance floor. This press release promised a fresh reflection on the killings, stepping back into the fog of the past to recreate the grand old dance halls of late 1960s Glasgow, with a few iconic musical numbers thrown in for good measure. Its director had been quoted in several pieces across the city's press, stressing that though he knew a Bible John musical sounded odd, it touched on a variety of wider themes, including the ubiquity of violence against women, just as live an issue in 2022 as it had been in 1969. He had been at primary school in Scotland during the early 1970s, when the name Bible John spoke to an ever-present bogeyman. And he had spoken to many others who had grown up in the era and collected their stories via social media. It was a tale ingrained in the Scottish mindset, and not just the Glaswegian one, he explained. The musical wouldn't focus on a particular victim or her murder, and Bible John would be played by 3 different actors to reflect the fact of the uncaught killer still squatting in the popular imagination. George Puttick had even given the production his blessing, as long as it didn't have anything negative to say about him or his family. Anything that kept Helen's name in the public eye could only be a good thing, he told the Daily Record. The hall was almost packed out by the time the lights dimmed around 7. On arrival, it had become clear that I was the youngest person in the theatre by at least 15 years, a fact reinforced by the occasional quizzical look which bent my way from the rows of families and couples in the aisles around me. An elderly man winked and waved at the can of Diet Coke in my hand, a gesture I returned with a friendly smile, even if I didn't fully understand its meaning. 3 women soon appeared on stage in what was evidently supposed to replicate 1960s youth period dress, all short skirts and outrageously loud patterned blouses. After some vaguely bawdy patter, the scene cut to a dance hall at night where 3 men appeared from the darkness, snarling and prowling across the stage in overly tight tartan trousers. The 3 would-be Bible Johns, searching for their next victim. The tone continued to jump in a way that felt increasingly alarming, from farce to murder mystery to heart-rending melodrama and back. Musical interludes came and went. It was clear enough from a cursory glance that the latter was what most of the audience had come for, as the 50-something couple in front of me began to sway and cheer whenever one of the old hits came on. We were introduced to the hard-bitten and harder-drinking veteran detective running the subsequent murder inquiry, who shook and bawled and wept at the enormity of his burden. It had quickly been revealed he was also the father of the youngest of the 3 women we'd been introduced to, as well as a remorseful, if regular, wife-beater. A respectful hush had descended when a blown speaker and uncooperative backing track sabotaged one cast member's solo as she stood frozen in place under the glare of the revolving silver disco ball overhead. The rest of the act passed in a blur. At the interval, I bought a glass of wine and stepped back to observe the people filing in and out of the theatre. I thought of how odd I must have looked, and began to wonder why I'd made the journey, and what I supposed this evening was or wasn't going to prove about the enduring fascination with Bible John. As the lights dimmed for the second half, there were 2 free seats where the enthusiastic couple in front of me had been sitting, which remained empty for the rest of the night. Chapter 12. The Drifter. The first time I spoke with David Swindle was via Zoom in July 2021. It had been a fairly short and scrupulously polite call. We spoke about my plans for the book and exactly what it was I was hoping to achieve with it all, and indeed why I was interested in the whole Bible John mythology at all. It seemed as if the answers struck the then 66-year-old as reasonable enough, as we ended our conversation by agreeing to set another date to meet in person, later in the year. He had a right to caution when it came to Bible John and his own brittle connection to the murders. Before his 2011 retirement, David Swindle had spent 34 years with Strathclyde Police, most of them in CID, before eventually rising to detective superintendent. There wasn't much that he hadn't covered over a long and preternaturally successful career. Murder cases were common enough, as were rapes, robberies, and human trafficking. Indeed, he had likely dealt with hundreds of killings over the years, according to the biography on his own website, though Swindles seemed unusual in having studied for a degree in forensic medicine at Glasgow University, as well as a postgraduate qualification in alcohol and drug studies. The same biography also speaks to his willingness to innovate and his role in developing crime investigation processes. It's the type of corporate jargon that can easily set one's blood to boiling point, though it had some justification in David Swindles' story. Most detectives go their entire career without a defining case, however senior they might climb. Years and decades pass, lived quietly in the slipstream of murk and violence, the everyday crush of misery and despair. It wasn't like that for Swindle. June 2007 had seen the then head of Strathclyde Police Public Protection become the senior investigating officer leading the inquiry following the Glasgow airport terrorist attack, in which a burning jeep had been driven into the main terminal building. Gordon Brown had become Prime Minister 3 days earlier, and the international media had quickly descended on the outskirts of Glasgow. No one was killed, save for one of the perpetrators, who later died from his burns in hospital. Swindle's work on the inquiry, seen as a swift, decisive and high-profile success, earned significant media attention and a glowing Chief Constable's commendation. Swindle had provided drive and inspiration to members of the team working under incredibly intense, difficult circumstances. Under the immense pressure of worldwide media scrutiny, he ensured that the excellent investigative reputation of the force was upheld. That particular success wasn't why David Swindle became one of the best-known police officers in the UK. The same year had also witnessed one of the most high-profile and sordid trials in recent Scottish legal history. In September 2006, a 23-year-old Polish student called Angelika Kluk had been reported missing the week before she was due to return home to Gdansk after a working holiday in Glasgow. It wasn't Kluk's first visit to Scotland. She had embarked on a couple of long trips around the country in 2004 and 2005. By the end of her second visit, she had become increasingly close to Father Jerry Nugent, the long-standing and popular priest at St Patrick's Church in Anderston, a large Victorian red brick pile dominated by the surrounding high-rises and motorway flyovers in Anderston, the working-class neighbourhood on the western fringes of the city centre. The area had fallen on hard times in the latter half of the 20th century, having been built into isolation during the 1960s construction of the M8 motorway, which cut the area off from the city centre proper. The area's fortunes had gradually improved by the early to mid-2000s, though no one was accusing Anderston of hoarding any excess glamour. It worked well enough for Angelika Kluk. Her flat on Elliot Street was nearby, and the church had rapidly become the central part of her life in the city. When her landlord asked her to leave the flat, Kluk had turned to Father Nugent for help. His offer was generous and immediate. There was a spare room in the chapel house, which he would be glad to give to her rent-free for the duration of her time in Glasgow. When she returned in 2006, the same arrangement held. According to subsequent reports, the last trip was not such a glowing success. There had long been whispers surrounding Father Nugent's increasingly erratic behaviour and unignorable drinking problem that often drifted into blackouts and bouts of deep self-recrimination. Sometime during her 2006 visit, Kluk had become romantically involved with Martin McCaskill, a married 40-year-old businessman who ran a chauffeuring service. On Monday, 25th of September 2006, McCaskill had sent Kluck the first in a series of increasingly anxious texts, asking about her whereabouts after she had seemingly disappeared the night before. St. Patrick's Church was known for its open-door policy. Though increasingly drunken and unreliable, Father Nugent was still serious about many of his duties. Around 2 months before Angelica Kluck's return, a wiry, grey-haired 60-year-old going by the name of Pat McLaughlin had shown up at the church, having been referred through the Loaves and Fishes homelessness charity, one of several active in the local community. The man was polite and well-spoken, and keen to make himself useful if he was going to be offered help and shelter. McLaughlin was also a skilled handyman, who seemed to relish his new role completing any odd jobs that cropped up around St. Patrick's. By the autumn of 2006, he had become a fixture at the church, though some of the long-time congregation thought it odd that the new arrival revealed so little about himself or his past. No one, however, thought it polite or necessary to press the attentive, enterprising figure who seemed so grateful to have been accepted into their community. If this were a horror film, then the man's appearance would be told in the first scene. The sudden arrival of the mysterious, retiring figure, invariably clad in a threadbare woolen jumper, soft-voiced and unmistakably Glaswegian accented. The shy, almost grandfatherish figure who fitted straight into the texture of everyday life around the church. Always ready with the offer of a favour or a few minutes of light and imprecise small talk. Lodged straight into the tight-knit inner-city faith community led by an increasingly erratic and out-of-control priest. Subsequent accounts stress how Pat McLaughlin looked good for 60, how strong and spry he was, how eager to please. They stressed the intensity in his dark eyes, though of course they would. Anything to appropriately foreshadow what the visitor was about to become, what he was about to reveal. It was later reported that Martin McCaskill had called Angelica Kluck's mobile over 25 times on Monday the 25th of September. By early evening, he decided to call Angelica's older sister Annetta, who was also living in Glasgow. The two of them met at St. Patrick's and made their way to Angelica's room, where most of her belongings sat untouched and apparently undisturbed. Handbag, wallet, laptop. Bank cards, passport, and her return plane ticket to Gdansk. The only thing missing was her mobile phone. From there, panic rose to a new pitch. The police were phoned and arrived an hour or so later. They were greeted by McCaskill, Father Nugent, and Annetta Kluck. Statements were given. Angelica was missing, and no one had an idea where she might have gone. Everyone at the church supplied a statement, including the recent arrival, Pat McLaughlin. The day passed somehow, even with all of their worry and strain. They prayed and tried to sleep. There was a feeling, and nobody said it yet, though perhaps everyone felt it, that something had gone very suddenly and very badly wrong. That something had changed. On the Tuesday morning, not too long after first light, Pat McLaughlin gathered up his meagre possessions and left St. Patrick's. The events of the day aren't known, though those of the night are. His phone had rung in the evening. A friend he had planned to meet in the city centre, though McLaughlin hadn't answered. It was late when he boarded the overnight coach to London at the St Andrew bus station in Edinburgh. His absence had already been noted back at the church. He hadn't turned up for work that morning, and Father Nugent had immediately become concerned when his phone calls and texts hadn't been returned. He knew that McLaughlin suffered from a serious heart condition. The handyman had often complained about it in laborious detail, and worried for his health. It wasn't long before the first reporters arrived at St. Patrick's. The missing student was already becoming news. There was just something about the bare bones of the story as it was already beginning to take shape. a pronounced nothing good quality. The police said that they wanted to speak with Pat McLaughlin, the disappeared handyman, but no one could trace him. There was a photograph of the man to go with the appeal, quickly disseminated to both the police and press. There was also quickly hardening talk that he was likely the last person to have seen Angelica before her vanishing. The missing girl was soon front-page news. Martin McCaskill publicly wept and pleaded for information. All he wanted in the world was for her to return safe and well. He loved her. Wherever it was or had been, it would be okay. His words were carried to the public by the Herald and the BBC. His wife Anne pledged to help and was seen around the local area, canvassing residents and handing out flyers. Despite the intensity of the coverage and the search, people were already beginning to speak about Angelica in the past tense as the days drifted on. Father Nugent offered a tribute to the girl, who was taking life on and meeting it with such gusto and charm. She had been so full of life, he said. She took part in everything and had loved Scotland, almost as if it were her other home. As each day went on, they were all praying for her very much. Angelica Klook's tarpaulin-wrapped body was discovered on Friday the 29th of September by a forensics officer who had opened a hatch on the floor next to the church's confessional box. Police had earlier discovered a loose table leg stained with her blood, as well as a pair of blood-soaked jeans in a bin on the church grounds. Klook's hands had been bound, and she had been tightly gagged. Her body was covered in a bin liner, which contained a blood-stained kitchen knife. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her face was badly disfigured. She had been raped. A young female forensic scientist named Carol Weston descended into the hatch to recover the necessary evidence. The space was dark and cramped, and bisected by a supporting wooden beam. Discussions had been carried out on exactly how to go about the job. Weston had been adamant. She had to examine the body in situ, rather than have it removed and taken to the police mortuary. There could be no chances taken. It had to be done right, and right meant descending into the hatch for 3.5 hours, examining the body and collecting the various samples that would later be used at trial. Pat McLaughlin was picked up at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, where he'd taken refuge complaining of serious chest pains. Though the frail 60-something man who had checked himself in might have looked exactly like Pat McLaughlin, he had given the name James Kelly. Tests hadn't discovered the source of his pain, and the attending doctor had been struck by his patient's lack of eye contact. A nurse at the hospital had recognised Kelly from the images now being disseminated far and wide via TV and the national newspapers, under yet another name. Neither Pat McLaughlin nor James Kelly ever existed, but Peter Tobin did, as the news reports made clear. A male officer from the Met was involved in a moment of unlikely farce when he arrived in the wanted man's room dressed in medical scrubs to identify the man whose face had by then already become synonymous with the missing student in Glasgow. Peter Tobin was born in 1946 in Johnston, a small Renfrewshire town around 20 minutes' drive from the centre of Glasgow. The second youngest of 8 siblings born to a council worker and housewife, the early signs weren't promising. According to his younger brother, Peter had always been wild. By the age of 7, he was placed in a reform school. By his teens, several later reports highlight his involvement in petty crime and theft. Some even mention an unsuccessful stint in the armed forces, though reports of him joining the French Foreign Legion have never been corroborated. In 1969 he married his first wife, 17-year-old Margaret Mountney. The relationship was marked by extreme violence. Tobin would keep Mountney prisoner at their flat in Shettleston in Glasgow's East End. On one occasion, a downstairs neighbour had contacted police when blood began to drip through the ceiling from the Tobins' flat. It was only when he was arrested on burglary charges in Brighton a year later that Mountney managed to escape the marriage. After serving 3 years of a 5-year sentence, Tobin married his second wife in Brighton in 1973. Sylvia Jeffreys managed to escape 3 years later, after a marriage that had produced a son and a daughter, who had died almost immediately after being born. Jeffreys was later to flee to a women's refuge and win a lifelong injunction against Tobin, preventing him from contacting or approaching her. Later, she recalled how her ex-husband had taken a job with the local water department early on in their marriage. He had seemed to enjoy it well enough. Part of the role involved intensive training on how to professionally dig trenches, a skill which seemed to coax something out of him, as if it was the most fascinating pastime in the world. The late 1970s and early 1980s remained something of a blank. Tobin was a drifter, and never really settled anywhere for too long or too deeply, as he flitted between unglamorous towns and odd jobs. Later, there were people who remembered him, or thought they did, spread all over the country, with a particular emphasis on the south coast. The faintly charming and evasive figure, the quiet and self-contained neighbour, a peripheral blur, here for a moment and gone the next. In 1986, the 40-year-old Tobin was introduced to 16-year-old Cathy Wilson at a biker bar in Brighton. She was young, naive, and had grown up in a fractured, dysfunctional family on the south coast. The couple were living together within 3 weeks. Tobin had promised her work at a local cafe, though the job never materialised. It wasn't long before Wilson became pregnant. Their son Daniel was born a year later. In 1989, the couple were married and embarked on a move hundreds of miles north to Bathgate, a quiet mid-sized town located midway in the sprawl between Edinburgh and Glasgow. The house on Robertson Avenue was a trap. Though the alternating bouts of charm, control and violence had begun long before the move, they quickly accelerated in Scotland. Cut off from any of her support networks, Wilson became further and further isolated. She eventually made her escape in April 1990, having secretly saved just enough money for a bus fare to London, with Daniel in tow. Word reached her that Tobin had attempted suicide after her flight. He had poisoned himself, the source told her, with amitriptyline, an antidepressant that could serve as a moderately potent tranquilizer when taken in enough quantity. Wilson was to settle in Portsmouth, though her fresh start was tempered when Tobin performed one of his routine cross-country moves to Margate, the then faded and faintly seedy Kent seaside town. The move from Bathgate had been sudden and decisive. After he'd applied for a council house swap, it had been granted when a middle-aged couple living at the 3-bedroom terraced house at 50 Irvine Drive had expressed interest in a move to Scotland. The threats began immediately after his return to England. He wanted access to Daniel and wouldn't stop until it was granted. By 1991, a regular enough routine had been established where father and son would be reunited for the odd weekend together, spent at the house in Margate. It's said that the little boy particularly enjoyed playing in the cramped back garden. The next move arrived just as suddenly that same year, when Tobin rented a second-floor flat in a nondescript block in Havant, just a few miles from Portsmouth. The events of 4th of August 1994 have been the partial subject of several TV documentaries and dozens of newspaper articles in the decades since, memorialised as one of the crucial landmarks in Peter Tobin's squalid and repetitively brutal biography. The two 14-year-old girls had ended up at Tobin's door by accident. They had been calling on a neighbour who was out. There is some discrepancy in the precise order of what happened next. Some accounts have the girls asking Tobin if they could wait in his flat a while, though others have it the other way around. Whatever the precise order of events, they entered, perhaps reassured by the sight of Tobin's 5-year-old son playing in the living room. They were given strong cider and vodka to drink. Tobin offered them some pills. He called them blues, and explained that he'd already taken 3 himself that day. The girls refused, though the alcohol soon took effect, with one of them passing out on the sofa. Tobin then appeared with a knife and told the still conscious girl that he would kill her if she continued to scream. There was a struggle, and Tobin was stabbed in the leg. Daniel wandered into the room and was immediately removed by his father. The girl was forced to down a cocktail of wine and pills, which eventually knocked her out. The other girl woke around 6:25 a.m. the next morning, with a bloodied bandage around her wrists, a tie around her ankles, and her friend lying unconscious next to her. After trying to wake her, she fled and raised the alarm. The smell of gas was thick and unmistakable. After sexually assaulting the teenagers, Tobin had turned on the gas fire in the living room to full blast and left, having earlier phoned Kathy Wilson to come and pick up Daniel. In a mirroring of the same cringing self-abasement that later followed the murder of Angelica Kluck, he told his ex-partner that he was experiencing severe chest pains and urgently needed to go to hospital. From here, Peter Tobin vanished. Days after the teenagers' abduction in Havant, a man named Peter Wilson introduced himself to a day-tripping Christian group in Brighton. The Jesus Fellowship group invited the charming and apparently destitute 47-year-old Scot back to their base at the King's House Centre in rural Warwickshire, where he soon offered to perform odd jobs around the place in exchange for shelter. Suspicions grew over the man's lack of plausible backstory and evident discomfort when confronted with the most basic questions about his past. Peter Wilson was eventually asked to leave, which he acquiesced to with surprising meekness. A few days later, members of the group had tuned in to the BBC's Crime Watch programme, which devoted a prominent section to Peter Tobin, the man they had briefly known as Peter Wilson. Tobin was arrested soon after in Brighton. At the subsequent trial, the presiding judge spoke of the potential lifelong impact on the two girls who had been viciously attacked. He offered to the court that it may well be that their prospects in life have been gravely and permanently impaired, before handing down a 14-year sentence. At the end of a brief news report on the trial, the Independent noted that the offences were apparently wholly out of character. On his release in May 2004, Tobin was put on the sex offenders register and moved to a flat in a Glasgow satellite town. Neighbours remembered a quiet elderly man who mostly kept to himself, save for a few afternoons at the odd communal barbecue. By October 2005, Tobin had vanished into the city proper, having been reported to police after threatening a 25-year-old woman with a knife. Efforts were made to trace him, though nothing came back. There was just under a year to go before Angelica Kluck was reported missing. When the trial began at Edinburgh's High Court in March 2007, the tabloid press began to compete over the most lurid scoop. Father Nugent told a Sunday paper that he and Angelica had been lovers, a story that her sister instantly refuted in her own evidence to the court. The next day brought news of an affair with a guitarist in the church's band and a merciless public dissection of the priest's alcoholism and credulity. Tobin's defence eviscerated Nugent and the initially shambolic missing persons search. Though Tobin strenuously denied murdering Kluck, it quickly became apparent that he had been the last person to see her alive. On 14th of April, the Daily Record's front page led with news of the jury being forced to watch a 15-minute video of Angelica Kluck's body under the church floorboards, which is described in as much detail as the paper could get away with. After a 6-week trial, Peter Tobin was found guilty of rape and murder on 4th of May 2007. While handing down a life sentence with a minimum 21-year tariff, Judge Lord Menzies spoke directly to Tobin. "In the course of my time in the law, I have seen many bad men, and I have heard evidence about many terrible crimes which have been committed, but I have heard no case more tragic, more terrible than this one. Any case of rape is serious. Any case of murder is serious. But what you did to Angelica Kluck was inhuman. You are, in my view, an evil man." Angelica Kluck's sister shouted out her thanks to the jurors as the verdict was read out. Later, the Kluck family issued a statement detailing their relief at the sentence and their thanks for the support from the Scottish public right from the start of their terrible ordeal. David Swindle had become a media fixture in the run-up to the trial, and has remained so long after its conclusion. It was his team that had gathered the forensic evidence the conviction had eventually hung on, the evidence so carefully taken from Angelica Kluck's body, as well as a blood-stained shirt found during Tobin's arrest, and his team that were to lead the newly formed Operation Anagram, set up to trace the peripatetic Tobin's movements over the previous 40 years. Whispers had begun almost as soon as Tobin had become the prime suspect in the Angelica Kluck murder. Rumours which David Swindle was soon to outline to the press. The ferocity of the attack had shocked detectives. It was rare, vanishingly rare, for a 60-year-old man to have killed in that way, or for the first time. It was possible that Tobin had killed before, perhaps many times. The search scaled up fast and pulled together multiple different police forces. At its height, detectives across the country were tracing thousands of lines of inquiry, from the English south coast to the Scottish central belt. Bank accounts were uncovered, and old addresses accumulated. It was thought that Tobin had driven and discarded up to 120 cars. Missing person files were reopened and poured through for any connection to the thin, just about elderly man embarking on his life sentence. Further searches of Tobin's previous homes in Margate and Bathgate in late 2007 revealed the remains of 2 more bodies, Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, 2 young women who had been reported missing in 1991, having last been seen in Bathgate and Hampshire respectively. There's no need to recount the particularities of their deaths. Both bodies were recovered from the back garden at 50 Irvine Drive, the narrow and unremarkable mid-terrace in Margate. The usual media circus descended, with former neighbours quizzed and pressed for a few scraps of detail about the dimly remembered man who had moved with such haste in the earliest 1990s. Some thought they recalled a strange and occasionally sinister presence, though most confessed that they hadn't considered him anything other than a quiet and unremarkably private man. Tobin was served with his 3rd life sentence in 2009, while Operation Anagram was wrapped up 3 years later, having failed to officially uncover any other victims. It's difficult to conclusively state who first made the link between Tobin and Bible John, though Professor David Wilson features prominently in most accounts. No one has ever accused the Scottish academic and celebrity criminologist of being slow to scent an opportunity. Indeed, when it comes to media bylines and publicity, Wilson's storied 25-year career is without contemporary rival in the UK. Much of his biography is well known, at least among the country's legion of true crime fans. It's also reported that he became the youngest prison governor in British history when he was appointed Assistant Governor at Wormwood Scrubs, fresh from his Cambridge PhD, aged just 29. The truth is slightly more complicated, though Wilson did work in the same role at a Young Offenders Institute during the same period. What isn't in doubt is Wilson's subsequent senior roles at HMP Grandin and HMP Woodhill, one of the most notorious prisons in the country. The media appearances began in 1999 and have accumulated at a rapid rate ever since. If a serial killer documentary is being produced in the UK, then Wilson is a good bet to be involved, whether as talking head or presenter. From Measuring Evil, Britain's Worst Killers to Killer Psychopaths, and David Wilson's Crime Files, the list is dizzyingly long. To watch an episode of any of these broadly interchangeable programmes is to understand the core of Wilson's enduring appeal. Erudite, earnest, and totally respectful of the genre's conventions, he comes across as every inch what we might expect of a criminal profiler. A potent mixture of the tweedily academic and the ruggedly hard-bitten. He speaks fluently, weaving facts with plausible, vaguely scientific theories. He doles his insights out with precision and wraps up the obvious with just enough dramatic panache to keep the viewer hooked, or at least entertained. An equally prolific author, he has written or co-written books on topics ranging from a history of British serial killers to a plotted biography of the Suffolk Strangler Steve Wright, who murdered 5 sex workers in Ipswich over the course of 2006. In Wilson's telling, his Bible John Eureka moment came at Tobin's trial for the murder of Dinah McNichol. That's how it's described in a 2010 article in the Daily Record, timed to coincide with the release of Wilson's book, The Lost British Serial Killer, closing the case on Peter Tobin and Bible John. The criminologist had been astonished to see the links between Tobin and the quasi-mythical Barrowland killer stack up in real time. It was chilling to see how they proliferated, he told the paper. Tobin was a demented serial killer who had grown up in and around Glasgow. He had likely attended the Barrowland Ballroom and was known to be well-spoken and attentive when he needed to be. There was a decent enough likeness to the famous photo fit, and the killings had apparently ceased after Tobin had moved south. There was even a point when Wilson had wanted to stand up and shout, "Peter Tobin is Bible John." Though there was no way of proving it beyond doubt, Wilson was confident enough that he'd stake his entire professional reputation on the fact. The book is an awkward, discomforting thing. It mixes reporting and loose social history to paint a picture of Tobin and Bible John, before trying to tightly mesh the two together, with frequent bursts of novelistic imagination. Kluke's murder is reimagined in penny dreadful detail, along with Hamilton's and McNichol's abductions. There are chapters devoted to long and thinly sketched criminal profiles of Tobin and Bible John, as well as the apparently unshakable similarities between the two, laid out in exhaustive, speculative detail. There are portions that feel rushed and incomplete. After 255 pages, the book ends with a simple declaration. Bible John? Case solved. For some, this has passed into canon law. The infamous killer finally caught in all but name after more than half a century. There were, however, several problems with Wilson's hypothesis, particularly that Tobin's first wife could provide a solid alibi for him for Jemima MacDonald's murder, despite her loathing for the man. The couple had been on their honeymoon, having been married just 10 days before. David's swindle was to publicly state that nothing in all the years of Operation Anagram could link Tobin to the 3 historic murders, a fact he reiterated to me during our first conversation. "Don't you think," he'd explained with a slightly exasperated smile, "that we would have been all over it if there had been anything at all substantial to go on?" Though he was sure that the extent of Tobin's crimes probably remained unclear, he was absolutely categorical in his denial that the sadist had anything to do with the Bible John legend. The whole circus occasioned by Wilson's book had been an irritant, he admitted. There was just so much else to do and so many other leads to chase. When I contacted David Wilson to see if he would be interested in an interview to discuss his position on the Bible John killings, the reply was brief and courteous. No, he wasn't able to help, but he sincerely wished me luck with the book. The initial automated response had listed several alternative routes of contact. For media inquiries, there was an agent. For urgent university work, a colleague could be reached first, while any information about a murder case should be referred directly to the police. And no, he couldn't undertake private investigations. The first time I met David Swindle in person was in early September 2021, in a high-ceilinged Glasgow bar not far from George Square. He'd arrived before me and had mentioned he'd be sitting at a table a slight remove from the main entrance. It was a warm, faintly hazy autumnal afternoon. We ordered coffees and almost immediately started back at Tobin and the origins of his association with Bible John. We spoke in detail about Operation Anagram and its dreadful revelations. Or at least, that's what I took down in my notes, after Swindle had expressed that he'd rather I didn't electronically record our chat. Notes were fine, but my dictaphone was not. There was a moment of high farce when I returned from the bathroom about halfway into our hour-and-a-half-long meeting. After smoothing down my coarse brown jacket, I was asked with evident sincerity, or at least a convincingly bland poker face, whether I was wearing a hidden wire. No new ground was covered. We looped back and forward across the mid to late 2000s, and arrived at the same conclusion I'd long already come to. Though Peter Tobin was a very real sadist and killer, he wasn't Bible John. Not for David Swindle or almost anyone else who intimately knew the story in 2022. As we made our way to leave back into the afternoon sunshine, a middle-aged woman stopped Swindle at the bar to say she was sure she recognised him from somewhere. From the moment of his 2011 retirement, David Swindle has carved out a successful media career of his own, speaking regularly about Peter Tobin and his new ventures, including Victims Abroad, set up to aid the families of Brits who have died overseas. His face has almost become a fixture in the Scottish media, whether in print or on TV. He replied to the intrusion with a laugh and a modest wave of his arms. After a couple of beats, the woman's confusion melted into delight. "Oh, from the telly!" She'd beamed right back at the retired detective's embarrassed smile. On taking our leave, we walked down to Glasgow Central Station through the crowds of Buchanan Street revellers and parted at the entrance with a firm handshake. There was about half an hour to wait for my train back to the south side, just enough time to reread my handwritten notes and cast my mind back to July 2018 and the last days of my first ever Bible John reporting trip. It had been a long week, though there was one more stop I'd wanted to make, though I'm not really sure why now, just as I wasn't then. It took about 15 minutes to walk to Anderston from the city centre, give or take. It felt longer on account of having to navigate the concrete imposition of the M8 motorway that runs straight through what was once the area's heart. St Patrick's is a large and unflashy red brick building tucked in from the roar of the traffic, giving it a sense of quiet and repose. There was a man sitting outside enjoying a cup of tea in the midday sunshine. He told me with a smile that the church was closed. There wasn't much to say back. Turning around, it felt good to get back to all the life and noise. Chapter 13. The Detective. July 2018 was unusually hot by Glaswegian standards. At least that's how it felt for the 2 weeks I was staying in an Ibis budget located in a baleful retail park 20 minutes southwest of the city centre. The World Cup was on, though the pubs were quieter than they had been in London. Perhaps I shouldn't have been too surprised. Scotland had again failed to qualify, the latest of 5 consecutive failures spanning 20 years, while England were doing unexpectedly well, even beating Colombia in a penalty shootout after a nervous and ill-tempered match. This wasn't, shockingly enough, cause for wild celebration in the centre of Glasgow. The trip was a success. At least, that's how it seems to me now at a few years' distance. I'd spent much of the time alone, in archives or occasionally meeting sources who could help explain different strands of the Bible John mythology. There were many miles of walking through the city, and many more hours spent in glum reading booths on the second floor of the Mitchell Library. Slowly, a picture had begun to emerge, or at least that's how it felt at the time. The places I'd only really read about that slowly revealed themselves and became familiar. Carmichael Lane, Bridgeton, the Barrowland itself. Though most things had gone to plan, it seemed as if there would be a few disappointments. I particularly wanted to speak with Joe Jackson, the long-retired murder squad detective whose storied career had come to an end in the early 1990s. His name had cropped up repeatedly, right across the start of my research. He'd worked the Patricia Docker killing as a young detective, and had a front-row seat for the birth of Bible John hysteria after Helen Puttock was found on 31st of October 1969. He'd worked closely with Joe Beattie, and had even served as one of the oft-derided Bible John dancing squad. I'd read his 2008 book, Chasing Killers, multiple times, for its insights into the methods and history of policing in Glasgow. It nestles into the subgenre of true crime biographies that peaked in popularity during the late 2000s, full of breezily-related hyper-violent anecdotes and mostly vivid period detail. The blurb tells you much of what you need to know. Credentials are laid out, and authenticity is established in the boldest terms. As a young cop, Jackson was menaced by Arthur Thompson, notorious Glasgow kingpin of the 1960s and 1970s. As well as his part in the hunt for Bible John, Jackson also locked up more than his fair share of sex beasts and cracked the hardest homicide nut there is. That is, a murder without a body. Joe Jackson, often called the real-life Taggart, the blurb also proclaims, didn't appear to be a shy man, at least from the impression of his literary output. Over the decades, he'd contributed to the odd documentary or article on Bible John, offering a few choice insights, usually delivered with an air of slightly inscrutable irony. But the 2010s had seen him drop out of the public eye due to ill health. I'd been passed his landline number by an acquaintance who worked as a reporter at a Scottish TV station. My first attempts were met by an answering machine. 3 days before being due to travel home to London, I finally got through. Joe was reluctant. He told me that he'd spoken on this stuff so many times that he wasn't sure what else there could be to say. After a minute or two, he'd relented, telling me to come down early the next morning. The bus was quiet, with only a few elderly women for company on the top deck. After heading an hour south through increasingly sedate Glaswegian suburbia, I'd arrived at the start of a neat new build estate. 10 minutes later, I was greeted at the front door of a prim, detached house by a man in his early 70s, wearing slightly owlish glasses, accentuating a pair of shrewd, alert eyes. The next hour or two were spent sipping coffee in Joe Jackson's shaded back garden, our conversation falling straight into the world of Bible John, lurching across space and time from the late 1960s to the present day. Our conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Francisco Garcia. I don't want you to have to rehash all the things you've said before. Joe Jackson. Anything you want to ask me, just ask. Francisco Garcia. You were a young detective when you worked on the case, weren't you? Joe Jackson. That's correct, yeah. I was working in the north side of Glasgow, in what was then called the North Division. Obviously, right, because it was in the north of the city. The nurse's murder happened in the south side. There were 8 divisions in the city at the time. It generally happened that the call would go out to all of them when a murder came in. 2 men, 2 detectives from each division. You'd go there and get given the menial tasks, knocking doors, etc. So that's what happened. That was our job initially. There was another side of the inquiry that should have been getting done. The divisional detectives should have been checking the types of people who are liable to commit these crimes in the area. This was a big problem with this particular crime. Really, what I'd have done if I was in charge of that, and I was in charge of many murders after that, was check the records. You always check your records. I have a feeling now that if they'd checked those records properly, this guy would have come up. The situation was, the things we were doing, well, it was merely checking and seeing if you could paint a picture with regards to what happened to this girl. It was obvious what happened. She said she'd gone to the Majestic, but went to the Barrowland instead. Those Thursdays, there was always a mix of people going without their spouses. Yes, it was called the Grab-a-Granny Night. Initially, we were told by the people that interviewed her mum and dad that she'd been at the Majestic. There was the nutcase there who said he'd dance with her all night. You get a lot of these people, trying to be superstars. He got short shrift. I was never involved in that side of the inquiry. There was the caravan near the locus. We came up one morning about 2 weeks in and the caravan was gone. We thought it was solved. But there'd just been the 2 murders over in Govan. Patricia Docker was left to the local division, and I don't know how they approached it then. Francisco Garcia. At that time, you can't have had an inkling about what would come next. It was a killing among so many others. Joe Jackson. No inkling. It was a killing. The girl was found lying up a lane. Her clothes were missing. I think she was killed in a car. She'd been near the lane in a car and he'd killed her before driving away with the clothes. There was the river nearby. Some of her belongings were found there. There was talk at that time of the white car that had been seen in the area. I don't know about that. It was never brought up again in the inquiry. That was as much as I had to do with it. After that, I went back to my division. Then there was the murder out in the East End. Jemima MacDonald. She was found in the close. The same carry-on. Strangled and raped. There was still no connection. Seriously, I don't know what the different divisions were doing. We're talking many years ago. The old-fashioned way of doing things. I don't know what was being done. I would love to have gone back and examined those 2 murders. I didn't get the chance to do that. Things roll on. After a period working in the flying squad, I came back to the division. That was when the 3rd murder took place, out in the Marine Division. It was running about 3 months before I was called in. That was Joe Beattie running the inquiry. I knew Joe. He was a senior detective to me, but we'd worked together before. He was a very strong character. You know, he was lucky. Or that's what he thought. Seriously. He thought he was going to make his name. By that time, the killings had been linked. There is a brief pause here in the recording. an allowance for a tiny yapping dog darting over to sniff at the biscuit crumbs around my feet. After he's gently shooed away, we continue. I know you're in the press. My son's in the press. My daughter's friends too. But Beattie was giving them far too much. When I was eventually running inquiries, I was always careful. The press can be very, very helpful. Or they can be destructive, right? You don't mind me saying that. You had to be very careful how you dealt with it. Joe had his picture taken outside the Barrowland and all that stuff. He quoted a thing to me one time, which ended up in the press. He said if he saw Bible John walking down the street, he'd know what pocket he had his change in. That was the kind of character Joe was. We were too focused on what he believed we should be doing. We should have been going step by step. Bible John should have been found. These inquiries should have been left to the individual divisions. We went to the dancing. We went to the dentists. There were so many people getting fired into the mix for all sorts of different reasons. Francisco Garcia. So many that there were the cards handed out, specifying that people weren't Bible John. Joe Jackson. I think there were about half a dozen people or something like that given these cards. I'll tell you, there was a guy who ended up in a very senior police role who was given one. He was just a young guy then, not at that level. Just a young guy who liked going to the dancing. But he looked like he was pulled up so many times. He was a nice guy. I knew him personally. The big problem was that Joe was pushing Gene, trying to get as much information as he could. They brought in the artist. Quite honestly, I think it was overdone. As a result of that, everyone got the wrong impression. They made him look special. The golden hair, the immaculate dress sense. You could see it yourself when you went in to question people at the dancing. You'd say to a girl, "Have you seen this man?" And she'd reply, "I wish I had." They made him such a good-looking guy. It was an artist's impression, and artists, as you know, will perhaps put their own slant on things. That was not the guy. Francisco Garcia. Who was the guy then? Joe Jackson. I think it was Peter Tobin. He had committed similar crimes before. How he slipped through the net at the time, I don't know. As soon as I saw Tobin, I thought, that's as near as you were going to get, if you put him into the time frame. Have you read what David Wilson said? If you look at that and the background to it, my own theory is that it was Tobin. I think it was Tobin. But I'm only an old cop speaking off the top of my head. If you've killed 3 then, if you have any brains, you'd leave. And that's what he did. Now, I'm not being derogatory. I'm just being truthful. There were many times when uniforms would go to people's doors and not interview people the way they should have been interviewed. They wouldn't get the necessary information. When you're training as a detective, you know how important it is to get a full statement. Everything was on paper then. You needed a good statement. If it didn't have enough information, then you were lost. Things weren't computerized. There were all these kinds of problems going on. That should not have stopped good detectives looking at it and saying, "OK, how do we solve this, and how have we solved other crimes like it?" Francisco Garcia. Why didn't that happen? Joe Jackson. I don't know. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but I did solve a lot of murders. You look at the background and say to yourself, where did that come from? With regards to Bible John, the guys who were running the early inquiries were happy when Joe Beattie took over because they could wash their hands of it. He's got it. We don't need it. Joe tried to build a big picture. He thought, this is mine. I want this. And it didn't work out for him. He was a good detective. He was a serious worker. Francisco Garcia. It was a high-stakes gamble. Joe Jackson. I know when you go into a murder inquiry, you look at every single thing you can. But everything was what Joe Beattie said. You had to go down that route. You could not deviate from his ideas. He was talking to Gene a lot. Joe would finish his work at HQ and head back out to the Marine and sit there until 3 in the morning. He was always there working at it. He'd often have Jean with him, going through photographs. I had a feeling at that time, a few of us in CID did, that we'd been drafted into the inquiry so that she could have a look at us. We kind of resembled who she'd described as Bible John. Unfortunately, I was one of the ugly ones, but I'm talking about some good-looking guys who matched the description. Jo used to bring them in so she could have a look at them. Everything was well-meaning, but it was being run on one guy's say-so. You'd bring someone in, and he'd take one look and say, no. Sometimes even with Jean sitting there, before she could even open her mouth. That's how bad things got, seriously. You didn't challenge Beatty. When he said that it was finished, that was it, finished. But you just don't do that. You don't ignore any detective. Whatever they come back with, you listen. I remember one inquiry I had. It was an old woman who had nearly been battered to death in the Gorbals. She was left lying in a room with a plastic bag over her head. She was taken to hospital, and we began to check everything. I was a detective inspector at the time, with a wee squad working on it. There was a scientist from HQ who produced these lights and started shining them in the door. He found a footprint, very distinctive one, though you'd have never picked it up without oblique lighting. We had this squad, with all these young guys too. One of them came to me and said there was a guy already locked up in Craigie Street whose print matched. He lived pretty much next to the old lady. It was him and his pal who'd gone in. They got 6 years each. You listen to these young detectives because their minds are working. They're trying to prove themselves. Beatty wouldn't do that. He wouldn't listen to anyone. As a young cop, you want to be involved. I'd worked on several murders before the Bible John killings, with some cracking detectives who really knew their stuff, who knew every angle. There was one time where I'd asked to go indoors during a murder inquiry in Easterhouse, learning while I was working about how it should be done. When you're running a murder inquiry, everything needs to be joined up. I feel with Bible John these things were not done. Another brief silence, terminated by my audible, anxious sip of the last dregs of coffee in my mug. Jo laughs. Joe Jackson. Sorry, you've just had to listen to an old man talk a load of shite here. Chapter 14. Hypervigilance. I'm not sure who saw who first at Lockerbie Station on a humid, overcast morning in late August 2022. My train from Glasgow had pulled in a little early, so I'd taken a couple of aimless loops of the station, past a row of low grey houses and deathly quiet pubs. Around midday, midday, a black Audi had pulled round the corner at the agreed-on time. Having clambered into the passenger seat and shaken hands with the driver, a diminutive blonde woman in her mid-70s, we quickly spun round and climbed out of the town centre traffic onto Carlisle Road. After a 10-minute drive, we'd arrived at Somerton House Hotel, a heavy slab of Victorian sandstone with a white conservatory protruding sharply from its side. I noticed that the car park was almost empty as we made our way inside through a doorway flanked with hanging baskets and two extravagantly sculpted sandstone lions. Inside was as quiet as I'd expected. Any traces of midday August sun had vanished by the time we made our way through the main bar, our footsteps muffled by the plush red carpet underfoot. My companion chose the table, a four-seater not too far from a window that overlooked the car park and the rolling dark green hills in the distance. A few tables down sat a pair of genteel-looking elderly women, chatting conspiratorially over a pot of tea. We ordered coffees, and I thought about instigating some gentle small talk with my companion, though it had rapidly become clear that this wasn't really Pauline Badger's style. After I'd set my dictaphone down, she'd rifled through her handbag for her glasses. Though the performance took less than a minute, it was time well spent. She managed to tell me that she'd been at the police station that morning to give evidence on an unspecified crime, and that I was a lot younger than she'd been expecting. It was her nature, it followed, to be precise, she continued in her clipped Mancunian accent, to do things in a very set and streamlined order, with the first thing following into the next, as logic should dictate. She had spoken to someone extremely senior in the military recently, who had mentioned their shared hypervigilance. Did I know what that meant? No, I wasn't sure. It meant existing in a state of constantly heightened alertness, of walking into a room and scanning it at imperceptible speed for any danger, real or perceived. In her earlier years it was a trait, or was it a gift, mainly focused on trying to identify IRA bombs before they were detonated. That's why she'd managed to recognize Bible John after all these years. It was as close as that, she told me, pointing an arm at the dining room where two middle-aged patrons slurped at their soups with bowed heads. They'd been less than 10 feet apart, so close and so long ago. She hadn't even realized until she'd seen the picture on the television. Anyway, she said after her arm had returned from the recesses of her handbag, still minus her reading glasses, "What was it you came all this way to interview me for?" I'd come across Pauline Badger's story at the end of January 2022. It wasn't long after a 2-part Bible John documentary had aired on the BBC, followed by a slow drip of news stories and follow-up pieces, mostly rehashing the story for the local news in Glasgow and its immediate surrounds. The programme was well made, though scant of much new information. It had ended with a dramatic flourish, with a brand-new artist's impression that had been laboriously composed to show what the killer might look like over 50 years on. The resulting image was of a severe and heavily lined face, below thin, dirty blonde hair. On 25th of January, I'd seen an intriguing piece published in the Scottish Sun, headlined, "Spitting Image. I'm convinced I met Bible John. I didn't make the link until I saw new photo fit of serial killer." It explains how a 74-year-old Dumfriesshire resident had been transfixed on watching the programme, with its new and updated photo fit of the handsome, mocking figure who'd murdered 3 women in late 1960s Glasgow. Pauline Badger had immediately contacted the authorities. There was no way she could be any surer. She'd seen that face, the pale, smiling figure with the crooked teeth. The encounter had occurred when Badger worked as a stewardess at RAF Halton, one of the largest bases in the country, hundreds of miles south in Buckinghamshire. It was as if she had a mental map of him walking and talking with those strange front teeth. The man was a technician who spoke as if he had a cigarette lodged in his mouth, even when he didn't. Badger repeated this for my benefit when we settled down after our coffees had arrived. In response, I tried to explain succinctly what it was I'd been working on. My well-rehearsed speech on how I wasn't looking to solve the case, nor did I hold the unshakable conviction that this might even be possible at all. How I was more interested in the history of the story and its reverberations down the decades, as well as the vivid, outsized place it still held in the minds of so many Glaswegians, and indeed so many people further afield, I hastened to add. She'd taken this in quietly, before fixing me with a tight, slightly quizzical smile. In the preceding weeks, we'd exchanged messages over WhatsApp after I'd tracked down her LinkedIn profile, a platform where Badger is an active and enthusiastic participant. Her profile listed a dazzling array of qualifications and professional achievements. Over the years, she had worked as an ethnographer, historical researcher, and unspecified freelance consultant on innumerable crime scenes and legal cases across the UK. According to her own sprawling biography on the site, she remained proud of her time in the RAF, having served between 1966 and 1969 as a stewardess at RAF Halton, while undergoing training at Spitalgate in Hereford. She'd worked in the officers' mess and as a VIP stewardess and served the royal family, along with various other dignitaries on those functions and bases. The following years saw her climb to senior aircraftswoman before moving to Singapore with her husband, a committed RAF man. The decades after that are left blank up until 1997, when she began an undergraduate science degree at the Open University. After that came a master's in medical and behavioural sciences and, in her words, a decade and more of collaborating with police forces across the country and beyond, assisting them as they tried to crack the most fiendishly difficult cases. Though I'd already brushed up on her garlanded career and manifold successes, Badger was quite happy to fill me in again before I could get a question in. Language mattered, she told me. Indeed, Bible John is a creation of language. I put this on purposefully, she said, gesturing to a pearl crucifix around her neck. It's like a taunt to Bible John. That's where I am. I really think things through. Just for the sake of the recording, I wondered if we could start with some more of her own biography. I wanted to know how a Lancastrian woman living in the Scottish borders came to be so invested in such a resolutely Glaswegian story. In short, I wanted to know a little bit more about her before we arrived at Bible John and any of her more specific thoughts on his identity. It wouldn't be that simple. Instead, she began by outlining a few of her own choicest ethnographic theories, the study and observation, she wanted to remind me, of people in their natural environment. In Badger's telling, it meant separating normal rubbish from unique rubbish. Though I wasn't quite sure I understood, she'd pressed on. Everyone wants to fit Peter Tobin into it. But Bible John was selective. They haven't realised because they haven't immersed themselves in the case. Pauline Badger was born in 1947 to a large Irish Catholic family in Manchester. Her early life in Salford was tough, though she didn't want to use the word poverty. She'd spent her teens and early adulthood around a range of colourful villains in the area and had been an avid attendee at a dancehall run by Jimmy Savile. That was about all she wanted to tell me about her youth, though she was happy to explain in detail how things took a darker turn when she'd met Ian Brady when she was 15, while working in a local department store. She had a lot to say about this, as well as him and Myra Hindley and the children killed on Saddleworth Moor. In fact, Badger had a lot to say about murder in general. Ideas and theories came freely, even before our coffees arrived. In her mind, Bible John was a bloodthirsty moralist. That was the only thing that made any sense. It wasn't for sex. It was to change these young women's lives around. He was trying to convert them. That's my view. These women were getting passed over in the nightclubs. Why were they going out with children? And why did they bring a man back when they had children? When I politely ventured that it was common knowledge that both Patricia Docker and Jemima MacDonald were estranged from their husbands, Badger was undeterred. Estranged is an academic word. She wanted to stress that her interest in the case didn't stem from anything as lowbrow as a prurient obsession with true crime, but from sober, rigorous academic analysis. A few weeks earlier, she'd sent me a lengthy voice message when I'd initially explained exactly why I wanted to meet and speak with her face-to-face, about how I was particularly interested in people who were still so avidly fascinated in the myth of Bible John, half a century on from the very real killings it represented. She had let me know that this had been an extremely poor choice of words. She wasn't a fascinated armchair detective. No, she was interested as a witness. Amid the overlapping streams of information and minute detail, we'd eventually got onto the topic of Rita Ellis, a 19-year-old servicewoman who was murdered at RAF Halton on 11th of November 1967. It was what it remains today, a sad, savage tale without anything in the way of resolution. On the night of her death, Ellis had been asked to babysit for one of the most senior figures at the base, a wing commander named Roy Watson. First, she had been escorted to the front of her accommodation block by a young RAF apprentice and his girlfriend, who left Ellis at 7:25 p.m. to head off on their date night. When Watson arrived to collect Ellis, she was gone. He'd waited for a quarter of an hour before leaving to get his wife, who would be allowed to enter the women-only block under RAF rules. But Ellis was nowhere to be seen in sight. Another car had pulled up before Watson's white sedan, which Ellis apparently willingly entered. Later, investigators believed that she likely took the figure to be Watson, who she hadn't met in person. The last sighting of her alive was at 8 p.m. It was a Saturday night, and the base was even busier than usual due to a disco and bingo night open to service people and local civilians alike. In the commotion, no one gave much attention to the car drifting slowly across the base. Ellis's body was found by a dog walker the next morning by a piece of woodland on the western fringes of the camp. The killer had made a cursory effort to cover her body under some foliage. She had been beaten and strangled with her own underwear, while the post-mortem brought up evidence of sexual assault. The case was immediately taken up by Scotland Yard in London. A local scrap dealer was questioned and released when his blood didn't fit against a sample recovered from the murder scene in the woods. Something strange happened at the inquest, straight out of the most hackneyed crime drama. The coroner ventured that he was almost certain that the killer would strike again. In the following months, 2 teenagers were attacked nearby, in the same corner of rural Buckinghamshire. Then a student nurse from Tring was attacked 3 miles from where Rita Ellis had been killed. The woman had been raped and beaten with a blunt instrument. Despite her injuries, she survived to give a description of her assailant. The man was aged between 25 and 35, with a long face and puffy eyes. Though there were no definitive links between the crimes, speculation mounted that they were all the work of the same shadowy figure. Before too long, however, the investigation had burned down to nothing. No leads, no suspects, and nothing approaching an ending. The crimes never really drifted into the wider public imagination, at least until 2007, when Thames Valley Police publicised a new cold case review on the 40th anniversary of Ellis's death. Though that failed to yield any answers, another appeal was launched a decade later, marked by a few headlines centred on a new DNA sample that was to be tested against the national database. Ellis's family were gently warned not to expect too much, even if a suspect was identified. It wasn't certain that the killer, whoever he might have been, would even be alive to face a trial after so much time had passed. In 2021, the case received further prominence in a Channel 4 documentary presented by Professor David Wilson and actress Amelia Fox, best known as the lead in the kitschy, long-running BBC crime drama Silent Witness. In the Footsteps of Killers sees Wilson operating at his theatrically supercharged peak, having bestowed several glittering insights, including that Rita may have known her killer. He reveals that critical evidence related to the case has been sealed away in the National Archives until 2070, marked as classified for reasons of national security. After I'd ordered a second coffee, Badger told me that she'd known Ellis. Not well, though the two were on friendly terms and had overlapped during their time at RAF Halton. She was the shy, plain girl on the periphery of social life on the base, and that had never been Badger's role. But yes, she'd definitely known the victim. Ellis had even borrowed money from her. Not much, but enough that it was still clearly a vivid recollection over 50 years later. I couldn't work out why she was always broke. She didn't really drink or anything like that. Not long before her murder, she had approached Badger one afternoon and explained that she thought she was going to be attacked. And, of course, Badger had reported this to Thames Valley Police when she'd seen the case publicised many years later. The Bible John killings had only begun a year later, and Badger was convinced there had to be a connection. Everything she'd read about the Glaswegian story seemed to bear exactly the same hallmarks as Rita Ellis's murder. It seemed odd, didn't I agree? The same man had to be responsible. The man she'd known from RAF Halton. Between Ellis's killing and Patricia Docker's murder, Badger's division was shipped abroad, though they would have been on leave throughout the dates separating the killings. It matched up perfectly. Did it? I wondered. It matched, I was assured. The ID papers that Bible John had allegedly flashed to Helen Puttock could have been an RAF-issued railway pass, which could have only been issued at the time. It would have been a pink slip of paper, which would have been appealing to a forces wife. He probably said to her, "I'm Sergeant or Officer such and such." Though I wasn't sure I followed, there was another set of questions I wanted to ask, as tactfully as possible. Badger hadn't come across Bible John until the BBC documentary aired in early 2022. It wasn't a name that meant anything to her before that, she admitted to me. I wanted her to describe that moment of recognition. What did it feel like? And how quickly had she felt certain that she'd met the figure captured in the new drawing? There was a slightly frosty edge to the first part of her reply. It didn't really bother me. It's just another Jack the Ripper. I'm not a fantasist or armchair detective, she repeated. I thought, well, this documentary is on. I'll watch it. I know people think it was Peter Tobin, but I don't think it was him. It was, she explained again. Something she knew from the second she'd seen the photo fit. I'd seen him before, and it was like I'd seen him again. More than seen. I felt him. I decided to change tack. What if, as many agreed, the famous portrait wasn't quite as accurate as it had once been built? You've got to think about proximity. She was sitting next to him in the taxi. How many people do you sit next to that closely? The police had taken Badger's report very seriously. Yes, she had pestered them until they'd taken a statement. The piece in the Scottish Sun had borne this out, with a polite generic statement at the bottom of the article detailing how they welcomed all new leads and were still refusing to rule anything out regarding Bible John. Where did this leave her theory then? And were there any other interested parties she'd spoken with about the case? I haven't got a theory about Bible John. I don't do theories, was the swift response, though she was planning to attend the upcoming Glasgow Crime Convention in early September. Pauline Badger wasn't the only person to report a fresh Bible John sighting to the police in the aftermath of the BBC documentary. It was a tale as old as the killings themselves, that had occurred throughout the decades. There would be a spark of some kind, a book, a newspaper feature, a documentary, an accusation that made the tabloids. The old photo fits and artists' impressions would be wheeled out to spark something in a murder-hungry public. Anything to keep the legend alive. Then the game would begin afresh, with a steady stream of information sent to police and reporters alike. The Daily Record's crime reporter, Jane Hamilton, had even written a piece on the burst of new activity and accusations. It mentioned a lab technician and a fairground worker, two local Glaswegian oddballs who had lived in the city during the late 1960s. They had come from exceptionally religious backgrounds, or had been fond of quoting scripture. The same old story, repackaged and resuscitated until the news cycle moved on and relegated Bible John back to the shadows. My conversation with Pauline Badger in Lockerbie had soon begun to skip across multiple different killings and theories, a densely knotted spider's web of detail and counter-detail. I sat and listened, interjecting where and when it seemed appropriate. It seemed as if she enjoyed having someone to speak with about the mass of violence and its enduring mysteries. Most of her community gathered online, though she did have a team of like-minded collaborators she occasionally met in the flesh. And I was happy enough to let it all wash over me. We lost sight of Bible John and returned to the Yorkshire moors, before striding back down to RAF Halton and beyond. An hour passed, then two, before my head began to spin. At last, I made my excuses and said I'd better start thinking of getting back to the train station and making my way back to Glasgow, as a bout of industrial action had crashed an already spotty timetable into severe unreliability. That was fine, she said. There were other things she needed to do with her day, but she dropped me off before running her errands and returning home to her house, the biggest in the complex, she assured me, where she lived alone, and had done so for quite some time. Chapter 15. The Reporter 2. By the late 2010s, if you read about Bible John in the Daily Record, then you'd likely read a Jane Hamilton byline. The deeply experienced crime reporter had covered it all, including every new lead or fresh false alarm that periodically cropped up, as it did after the BBC's 2022 documentary aired. I'd spoken with Jane a few times over the course of my reporting, and she was always unfailingly helpful and generous with her time and insights. When we spoke at length for the second time in the early autumn of 2022, she had just left the Daily Record after a long association with the tabloid. She had been covering crime for a long time, she told me with a laugh, and if she wasn't done with it exactly, then it was certainly high time for a break. I'd wanted to talk with Jane, as it seemed important to document the ongoing link between the Record and Bible John, a knotty and often difficult relationship by now well over half a century long. Aside from a couple of other honourable exceptions, it was hard to find another working journalist with the same depth of knowledge and self-awareness regarding the killings. Hamilton had long been close to George Puttock and was planning to visit him later in the year, being mindful of his ill health. They had first met many years before during a temporary lull in interest around the murders. It had been tough for Puttock to understand why no one seemed to be interested in his wife's killing anymore, and why her name had been allowed to fade from the public eye. From those beginnings, Hamilton and Puttock had spoken often and at length, collaborating for many different pieces, until Hamilton's decision to leave the paper. It would be a mistake to think Bible John represented Jane Hamilton's entire career, or that it was an obsession or anything like that, though it wasn't to be denied that she had devoted a great deal of her working life and energy to the story. There was always something new to report, whatever it did or didn't add to the already vast body of Bible John literature. Always something that cropped up to bring the old story back to life and a new readership. Our conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Francisco Garcia. How did you end up as a crime reporter? Jane Hamilton. Strangely enough, it was by default. I was actually a transport reporter at the Edinburgh Evening News. You know, covering trains, planes and automobiles. The crime reporter before me had left and they didn't have anybody. I was covering the bus wars at the time. Edinburgh was engaged in this massive, almost organised crime group style bus war between these two companies, and it was getting really heated between them. We were strapped for people one day, and this drug story had broken. The news editor said, "Jane, I know this isn't your specialty, but can you just do it?" So I did. About 3 days later, I got what ended up being the scoop of the year. I got wind from a contact who told me that Edinburgh was getting rid of its tolerance zone for sex workers. Well, Leith more specifically. If you call Leith part of Edinburgh, you can get your head chopped off. The Port of Leith was very well known for its street prostitution. The police had traditionally turned a blind eye to it for decades. I'm talking about many, many decades, probably back to the 40s, 50s and 60s. The women were given a free rein as long as they didn't annoy the local residents. That went for the curb crawlers too, who were exempt from prosecution. Edinburgh was quite forward-thinking, and they were trying to follow the Dutch model for the policing of sex workers. I got a tip-off that they were scrapping it and planning to criminalise the women. Not the curb crawlers, the women. This was the early 2000s, and it was thought that big strides had been made. Edinburgh had come through the AIDS crisis, and there had been a lot of work going on with the women, trying to ensure their safety. Anyway, that was the story. It went national and worldwide, and I thought, wow, I quite like this sort of world. I'm bored with buses. So I started to do more and more crime. I did an unsolved murder series, and the rest is, as they say, history. Francisco Garcia. When did you start at the Record? Jane Hamilton. 8 years ago, though that was my second stint. I was with the Sunday Mail from 2004 to 2008. I was at the Sun after that, then freelance, and the Record managed to entice me back in 2014. I stayed another 8 years. I've been everywhere. Francisco Garcia. Always in Scotland? Jane Hamilton. Yeah, I never had any desire to go to London, or anywhere else. I think crime is more ten a penny in London. Up here, crime is always quite an important subject in a way it isn't down south, unless it's something like Soham or Sarah Everard. Crime sells up here. That's why it's a focus for a lot of the papers up here. Crime is often better on the front page than politics. It goes through phases of popularity. Since Netflix, the true crime world has exploded, and there's a lot more interest in it. I've been plying my trade for 23 years, and the last 4 or 5 have seen a massive change in attitudes. The public wants to hoover it all up. They just want to hoover up true crime. Francisco Garcia. Was Bible John something you'd been aware of for a long time? Or did that only come later when you became a crime reporter? Jane Hamilton. I was vaguely aware of it. There's a weird dynamic in Scotland. The East and West don't really pay much attention to each other. Edinburgh had its fair share of murders. The city has its own dark stories to tell, but you were vaguely aware of these big stories from further afield. I know it's probably not what people want to hear, but we are a very parochial nation. We're closeted in our own areas. So I was aware of Bible John. Of course I was. It would come on the news now and again, or you'd pick up a paper and someone would be doing something on it. But it didn't really start to fascinate me until I started at the Sunday Mail. I'd gone down to the archives one day and came across all the Bible John files that we used to have. I just became fascinated by it and asked my boss if I could investigate it. And I've done nothing but investigate it since, 2003? Francisco Garcia. That's why I enjoy talking to people who have such a long history with the story. Your thinking on it must have changed so much over the years. Jane Hamilton. Yeah. It probably wouldn't have been such a massive part of my career if it hadn't been for Peter Tobin. I was the first journalist to break his story and to interview his wife and son. I interviewed all three of his wives, actually, and was very much involved in the Angelica Klug story. I went over to Poland to meet her family, and was there the day her body was found in the church. Tobin became entwined with Bible John, and back in those early years there was always this thing in the back of my head. Maybe he is, or maybe he was responsible for one of them. But then you dig into Tobin and realise that he couldn't have been responsible for any of them. The evidence just isn't there to put him at the scene of any of the Glasgow murders. I'm no Tobin cheerleader. I absolutely despise the man. But he isn't and wasn't Bible John. I was so involved with both cases, and they were so heavily linked. Well, everybody thought it was him. I've kind of been fighting against that for all of these years as well. You know, the Bible John story maybe took a back seat, but the narratives are so close it was impossible to do one without the other. And then I became friendly with George Puttick. No one had written anything about it for a long time, until I did, and no one had approached George for a number of years. He thought everyone had forgotten about his wife, until I started writing pieces about it. Until I started dredging it all up again. You always have that fear, certainly when you're coming at something new that hasn't been in the public eye for a long time, that you're just dredging up pain for these families. But you realise that bringing these so-called cold cases back with the best of intentions, well, it can make the family feel better. It makes them feel like their relative hasn't been forgotten. There's the chance that someone might come forward with information, like the Mary McLaughlin murder. Note: Mary McLaughlin was strangled in Glasgow in 1984. In December 2019, Graham McGill was arrested following a cold case review and found guilty of her murder in 2021. The forensic scientist saw my story in the paper when it hadn't been covered for about 20-odd years. I'd come across it doing the Unsolved Murder series, because that's obviously my specialty. I wrote a big story with her daughter, and these things do make a difference. You don't know who's talking to who about it. And 35 years later, they got the guy. That's the way I approach these stories. I'm not doing it just to have a byline or just to have a story in the paper. I do it with the best of intentions in the hope that these unsolved murders can be solved, or that we can at least get some answers for these families who spend years, who think everyone has forgotten about their relative. Francisco Garcia. And that's the reality of it all. There were these victims and these families who were devastated. Jane Hamilton. It's the women that need to be the centre of this story. I've been guilty of it myself. The story becomes about the killer. I've done it with Peter Tobin. The story becomes about him, and the victims do get pushed to the side. They get pushed aside when they should be at the front of it from the very beginning. A lot of what George and I have done over the past 10 years is remind people that 3 women were murdered. It's been challenging as the other families never wanted anything to do with it, so it became centred around Helen because I can't speak for the other 2 families. Francisco Garcia. These families were all different and approached their grief differently. Jane Hamilton. There was another story I did, from the 60s as well actually. The murder of a woman who nobody had ever written about, apart from briefly at the time. I approached her then elderly son and told him I'd like to do a story about his mum, and did he mind? He and his daughter were so lovely. They welcomed me into their home and told me everything. I was able to investigate the murder, and the upshot was that the police eventually named a suspect. Almost 50 years had gone past, and they'd never had a name. It had plagued him his whole life. He was 72, and he said that no one had ever cared about what happened to his mum. The police couldn't get any evidence, and as so often with these things, it died a death, for want of a better phrase. There hadn't even been a cold case review. That was my motive for writing about it. I knew there hadn't been a review, and I wanted to get it out there. People criticise when we bring up cold cases. I hate the term, but it's difficult to call them anything else. We bring up these unsolved murders. But if I can't bring anything new to the table, then I'm not doing it. Chapter 16. The Convention. The date of 10th of September 2022 had been marked in my diary for quite some time before I'd made my way up to Scotland the month before, for yet another Bible John reporting trip. Before leaving home, I'd vowed that this would be different from the ones that had gone before. No more living alone in whichever hotel or Airbnb presented itself. Instead, I decided to lodge with my old friend Sonia in her flat's temporary spare room for the chance of some companionship, as well as some necessary perspective from someone who wasn't spending their waking life with a half-mythical serial killer. The 9:07 train from Euston to Glasgow had been cancelled, and the replacement severely delayed. Tempers soon rose, and passive aggression flourished in the stuffy, overcrowded carriage. Hours passed before I finally arrived in Glasgow via Edinburgh Waverley, where I caught a taxi down to Mount Florida, a solid little chunk of suburban South Side. I'd quickly unpacked and made sure to stow the tattier, or more alarming crime paperbacks underneath the tasteful literary fiction I'd also made sure to bring. I'd seen the upcoming Glasgow Crime Convention advertised online earlier in the summer, before Pauline Badger had mentioned it over WhatsApp. An American invention, it was the first of its kind to be hosted in the city, following a few years of thriving London events. The premise was simple enough. Whether in Las Vegas or the towering Hilton Hotel yards from the M8 motorway which cleave through the centre of Glasgow, true crime, as the official website puts it in unmistakably giddy advertising speak, is so much more than murder recreations and dramatic courtroom showdowns. In fact, it would be a profound mistake to ignore the complexity and richness of a genre stuffed with real-life stories of triumph and tragedy, heartbreak and heroism. There would always be something for everyone. Fun for the entire family, or at least for those interested in the criminal mind, the criminal act, and the criminal justice system leaping into action. It was about nothing less than science, art, psychology, and history. Perhaps more than anything it was, as the mission statement promised, a reflection on the way we live now. Each event could offer a diet of talks from the very best podcasters and documentary makers, as well as the insights doled out from a revolving cast of detectives and forensic experts. It was all about creating the perfect balance between the educational and the experiential, to curate a programme that had more than its fair share of hands-on learning and fun centred on meeting the great and the good of the true crime community. But that wasn't everything. There was hardly a day that went by when the team at the American CrimeCon HQ didn't soberly contemplate the victims. Of course, everything they did was grounded in respect for the families left behind, as well as the law enforcement officials who spent their time chasing the terrible killers and sadists who formed the basis of the talks and panel discussions. The Glasgow event promised to uphold these deep-set values, as I'd been informed over the phone by one of its organisers, Susie Fraser, an experienced public relations expert and writer, who had spent much of her distinguished career split between her home city and London. Tickets to Glasgow CrimeCon came in at £230 a head, though Fraser was happy to allocate me a press pass on good faith that I wouldn't trash the event. It was all about the victims, she'd repeated over the phone. She'd also explained that she knew the Bible John saga intimately, having grown up in a journalistic family who'd been around the city throughout the peak of its initial hysteria. The entrance lobby was already crowded by the time I'd arrived at the Hilton around 10:30 a.m, jostling with a mixture of arriving crime fans, as well as the outrageously well-sculpted figures I took to be the athletes arriving for the Davis Cup tennis matches that were scheduled for the coming days, according to the signs dotted around the ground floor. The convention had taken over the spacious conference rooms on the hotel's third floor, and it was clear enough that the programme had already hit its stride by the time I picked up my pass and made some introductory small talk with the solicitous Fraser and some of the other organisers at the stall by the entrance, which offered a range of CrimeCon-branded merchandise for sale. £14 would get you a water bottle, though a bookmark could be purchased for a third of the price. I explained that I was happy to just observe for a while, though I'd perhaps be keen to speak with some of their guests later on in the day. The attendees were more diverse than I had expected. But what exactly was it that I'd had in mind? The reality was a tangle of smiling middle-aged couples who walked by hand in hand through the foyer, stopping only to dreamily skim the blurbs of the books piled onto stalls manned by eager young booksellers. A number of lone women around the same age loitered slightly awkwardly by themselves, turning their programme leaflets over and over in their hands, though there was no sign of Pauline Badger. It wasn't simply a middle-aged crowd, as I soon discovered by speaking briefly with a 20-something man in a faded band t-shirt and black trilby, who explained how awesome the true crime community could be and how excited he'd been for his first CrimeCon. He'd arrived with two of his friends from their home in a Glasgow satellite town, though he didn't really have any thoughts on Bible John or anything like that. He was just excited to meet like-minded people, he told me, before bounding off into the talk that was about to begin. On stage, a handsome 30-something man in a waistcoat was explaining exactly what his job as a forensic psychiatrist entailed. It wasn't really like the movies, he stressed, though it was certainly eventful in its own way. The talk centred on the not guilty by reason of insanity plea, and what it meant in reality, rather than myth. Juicy case studies were offered up to an appreciative audience, before a lengthy plug for his debut book, In Two Minds, Stories of Murder, Justice and Recovery from a Forensic Psychiatrist. Dr. Soam Das wanted us to know that he had very little time for psychiatrists who were looking to establish lucrative media careers, and that we should treat them with appropriate suspicion. Though that rule didn't count for him, of course, he hastened to add with well-oiled comic timing, to a ripple of light applause and laughter. The book was essential reading for anyone with an interest in true crime or mental illness, and it didn't end there, we were assured. "Buy the goddamn book," exhorted the laughing figure on the stage, before pointing us in the direction of his YouTube channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. David Swindle was due to appear at two discussions, including a panel that promised the full inside story on Peter Tobin, along with Carol Rogers, Nee Weston, the forensic scientist who had descended into the depths of St. Patrick's Church to attend to Angelica Klook's body. But first, at 12:15, there was to be another panel highlighting the retired detective's more recent venture, with his team of multilingual experts at David Swindle Crime Solutions and his charity, Victims Abroad. I took my place in a row of seats near the back of the room, to watch as a short tribute to Kirsty Maxwell played on the screen by the stage. Note: 27-year-old Kirsty Maxwell died in mysterious circumstances on holiday in Benidorm in 2017. the circumstances of her death remain unexplained, while her family have complained of a lack of cooperation from the Spanish authorities. The video, haltingly narrated by Maxwell's mother, was short and scrappily produced. She explained a portion of their family's pain, as photos of a pretty, smiling young woman blurred past. When the screen turned to black, David Swindle said a few words before introducing the Maxwell family. When they'd taken in their polite applause, Kirsty's father stood up to deliver a short speech about his daughter, who had died so senselessly in Spain. All they wanted was the truth, he said, though it still felt very far from their grasp. As the audience thinned back into the foyer, the call went out that it was time for the buffet lunch. The atmosphere had begun to drift into the vaguely carnivalesque, with most of the natural residual big crowd awkwardness having evaporated over the course of the morning. David Swindle walked past, though he didn't appear to see my waved greeting. The queue moved slowly, if at all, and the round conference tables began to fill with revellers and paper plates laden with bao buns and pakora, salad and huge fluffy potato wedges. The morning's programme of murder and unfathomable grief didn't appear to have dulled anyone's appetite. I took a seat with the remainder of the solo crowd and started on my foot, before making pleasant small talk with a smartly dressed woman in her early 50s, who said she was here for one of her favourite writers, who was due to appear after lunch. "And who is that?" I asked. Her only reply was a slightly pitying smile and a pair of involuntarily raised eyebrows, as if she couldn't quite believe her interlocutor's naivety or ignorance. Colin Sutton appeared 35 minutes later to a chorus of cheers and stamped feet. The ex-Met Detective Chief Inspector and SIO billed as the real manhunter and introduced as the man who needed no introduction, took to the stage and waited for the adulation to subside. A cheery, slightly florid bald man in his late 60s, Sutton had achieved a rarefied celebrity status in the world of true crime fandom after retiring in 2011 from a long and eventful career in the Met. He had opened a private investigative practice before penning his wildly popular memoirs. First came 2019's Manhunt, the story of Sutton's crucial involvement in the Levi Belfield case. Belfield was a serial killer and rapist who was served a whole-life tariff in 2008 and another in 2011, after being found guilty of kidnapping and murdering 13-year-old Millie Dowler in 2002. Sutton had followed the first book's success with another edition of Manhunt, this time centred on his role in apprehending Delroy Grant, the South East London serial rapist who became better known as the Night Stalker. Not to be confused, of course, with the infamous LA serial killer Richard Ramirez. The audience sat rapt as Sutton unfurled his well-honed performance, a mixture of deadpan seriousness and fluid storytelling, mixed with just enough safely ribald asides to keep the mood from curdling entirely at the horror on offer. The audience questions were plentiful and enthusiastic. Some wanted to ask about a specific strain of procedural detail or what Sutton thought of the current state of policing in the UK. Others simply wanted to ask what he thought about Martin Clunes, the actor cast as Sutton in the ITV adaptation of his memoirs. "Oh, Martin was a very good guy," Sutton explained. "He'd liked his performance very much, though he'd had to occasionally tell the actor to lighten up slightly." As the chair signalled that the session was drawing to a close, another burst of hearty applause rang out as Sutton beamed back appreciatively at his audience. As Sutton retired from the stage, it had seemed like a decent chance to catch my breath. The podcast row sat in the room next door, with a spread of individual tables, each one representing a specific long-running show. Crimepedia jostled for foot traffic with Scottish murders and the UK True Crime podcast, among others. The room was almost deserted after Sutton's star turn, though I exchanged an indulgent smile with a man briefly manning the Scottish murders desk, before helping myself to a respectful handful of branded pens and badges. The next panel dealt with Scotland's most evil killers. It felt odd that so much of the day had passed without even a cursory mention of Bible John, though it seemed as if this was about to change. The screen flashed up with a who's who of the country's most notorious serial murderers and rapists. Dennis Nilsson sat next to Ian Brady, who was placed by Angus Sinclair, Edinburgh's World's End murderer, and Peter Manuel, while Robert Black, convicted of raping and killing 4 children, and Peter Tobin shared the space at the bottom of the graphic. Colin Sutton had reappeared, along with another ex-detective who looked to be his slightly younger doppelganger. Dr. Soam Das also returned with a new addition to the panel, a veteran forensic scientist and research professor at Strathclyde University named Jim Fraser. At once, it felt like a slight strain lay under the panel's surface-level bonhomie. Colin Sutton said he didn't know how to answer a question from the chair about the most evil killer on the list, as the choice was rather like being forced to pick your favourite STD. As the laughter died down, the question bounced to Jim Fraser. No, he didn't really agree with the premise and wasn't sure it was a particularly useful lens through which to talk about these terrible crimes. But if he had to pick a particularly harrowing case from his own career, then he supposed Robert Black would have to be up near the worst he'd seen. The chair said she knew that there was no way of being in Glasgow not speaking about Bible John, as an appreciative murmur spread across the room. Did the panel have any thoughts about the terrible killer that had stalked the city in the late 1960s? Most hedged their bets or excused themselves from a case they didn't really know all that much about. It was hard with these old cases, Colin Sutton said, as so much had changed in the decades since. Policing culture and practice. Technology had also advanced beyond belief, and it was perhaps just not fair to compare now with then. Jim Fraser had slightly more to say about the old legend. Though he was no expert, he wasn't quite convinced of the existence of a serial killer at all. It had always been a bit flimsy, he explained. Religion had been everywhere in the Glasgow of the late 1960s, and a well-dressed man reaching for a bit of scripture in conversation wouldn't have been so desperately unusual. 3 women had been killed, yes, but there was no overwhelming evidence to suggest an uncaught serial killer. His words were not as enthusiastically greeted as those of his panelmates had been. The conversation moved on. One thing they could all agree on was that any resolution seemed unlikely now, viewed from the autumn of 2022. When question time came, a middle-aged woman took up the microphone and addressed the room. "You say it's unlikely," she opened, "but perhaps all the inquiry needed was someone with the skills and nous of Colin Sutton." The laughter turned to cheers, as Sutton waved modestly back. As the session ended, another break was announced for coffee and book signings. Jim Fraser was already deep in conversation with an audience member by the time I made my way back into the near-empty main room. We spoke briefly and exchanged contact details. He reiterated that he wasn't anything approaching a Bible John expert, though he'd be happy to talk sometime. The same young man I'd seen earlier, his trilby still firmly planted on his head, chatted happily with his friends and a couple of slightly older attendees. The charge of the early afternoon had been replaced with a tranquil contentment, as people contemplated their freshly signed books or ordered drinks from the bar. Though few people had left the third floor, it seemed quieter, or perhaps just less frantic after Colin Sutton's appearance. In the weeks after, I'd read that the crowd had peaked at 500, though it hadn't felt as packed as all that. Perhaps it was just that a coziness had descended, which almost verged on the conspiratorial. After almost 7 hours at the Hilton, I wasn't sure how many more panels I had left in me, though there was one that I'd circled as unmissable weeks before. At 5 p.m. sharp, David Swindle arrived on stage with Susie Fraser and Carol Rogers. The talk covered mostly familiar ground: Tobin's crimes and Operation Anagram, Swindle's role in it all, and his belief that Tobin had likely killed more victims than he had been charged with, or perhaps ever would be. There was the explanatory section and the myth-busting one. He poured scorn on the suggestion that Tobin had killed 48 people, or that he had a link to the supposed Bible John murders. It was simply lazy reporting that had built the first into myth, while the second never really had much basis in fact to begin with. At the very start of the session, space had been devoted to the lives of Angelica Kluke, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. The screen was lit up to show their smiling faces, from the familiar pictures that had become synonymous with their names over the years. The 3 smiling young women who barely had the chance to become themselves. Susie Fraser asked for a moment of reflection, and wondered if the audience knew about the church a few hundred yards from the entrance of the Hilton Hotel. There were nodded heads and a minority of blank looks. It was St. Patrick's, the same church where Angelica Kluke's body was found in 2006. An unignorable hush had descended when Carol Rogers began to speak about her role in securing the desperately needed evidence from the badly battered body that had been discovered under the floorboards. She'd only been in the job for a few years when the call came in, though no one needed to tell her what rested on her success or failure. Rogers spoke clearly and without any unnecessary flourishes about the eerie focus and calm that had descended on her. Any trace of the previous jocularity in the audience vanished. When it came time for questions, a figure near the front asked whether she'd been nervous or scared. Rogers said that it hadn't really come into it at the time. There was a job to do, and it had to be done right. Justice, or something like that, had depended on it. When the talk ended, and the applause died out, I said my polite goodbyes and waited for the lift that would take me down to the ground floor and back out into the fresh air. The sky was a dull metallic shade of grey, though the early evening light still stung my eyes after a day of the conference room's artificial rays. St. Patrick's squatted to my left, as I walked past the Mitchell Library and up into the West End, where I was due to meet some friends to talk about anything other than serial killers, or murder, or young women brought to the most terrible, pointless endings. Chapter 17. The Letter. The weeks after Glasgow CrimeCon passed quietly enough, just as the ones before them had. On the 12th of September, I'd finally packed my suitcase and caught the train back home to London, on an overcast and nothingy Monday night. The month in Glasgow had passed easily enough, though without any real sustained distraction or release from Bible John. To the end, I had kept to the same tightly regulated schedule. Up early to pour through the previous day's notes and writing before setting off from my sublet in Mount Florida, around 50 minutes' walk from the red sandstone tenement that Patricia Docker had once shared with her parents and young son. From the south side, I'd catch the train into town and make the 15-minute journey by foot to the Mitchell Library, to begin the day afresh at 9:30 a.m. The morning would pass with the same stack of books and microfilm, or by my transcribing the latest interview, before I tried to distill the bulky mass of information into something comprehensible during the afternoons. When this routine ran smoothly, I could leave the 5th floor a contented man at 7:30 p.m, before making the reverse trip to Mount Florida. This was how the days passed. The airlessness made sense, or seemed to make sense to me then. It felt like paying due fidelity to the story and its litany of false starts and dead ends. The white noise and dud theories in the margins that required ever greater attention to unpick and rethread together into a recognisably orderly narrative. When the library shut on Friday evenings, I'd meet some friends for a drink, before spending the weekend afternoons walking around the city, from what struck me as an increasingly depressed centre, and out east to the Gallowgate and occasionally beyond. The Barrowland would always loom into view as it had done for countless revellers over the decades. The same grand old venue that had reopened after the 1958 fire that had warped and gutted its original iteration. It wasn't difficult to stand outside and imagine the chaos and often frenetic energy of the supposed glory days described in the old histories and chronicles of the city's past. The tail end of the mythical golden age of immaculately dressed innocence, where a night at the dancing would set you back a few shillings for entry and a bus or taxi home at the end of the night. Where beaming men and women in their best clothes poured in and out from the inner city and beyond, right back to the freshly built schemes and estates on the city's outer fringes. This is a myth that often acknowledges its own darker side and its muddier, uglier clichés. The dizzying rate of social change and accompanying fear and isolation that had set in by the late 1960s. The rise in violent crime that seemed to be sweeping across Glasgow like a bout of fever, so adroitly packaged and disseminated by a powerful and brashly self-confident tabloid press. It was right there to read about every day almost without fail at breakfast or dinner, whether morning or darkest night. The latest teenage gang member who had it coming, stabbed to death in a brief bout of hellish urban warfare, or the occasional angelic female innocent found killed in an overgrown and lonely cemetery. The victims grouped into the deserving and undeserving dead alike. Bible John captured the mood and gave shape to it. It gave a name to the anxieties rippling through the city. It made sense in its own powerfully modern way. There was no doubt that it was inspired work from John Quinn or whoever else might or might not have been responsible for the coinage of the name. A name so simple and clear. The terrible red-haired figure that stalked the night, quoting scripture and searching for married women to seduce and murder outside their own homes. This spectre was far easier to understand and accept than a city where violence was becoming a threat or a fact of daily life for so many. It was often said that it could have been anyone, a saying that cuts straight to the heart of the story's power. Whether the work of one man or three, there was never any shortage of plausible killers or potential suspects. Perhaps the crimes would have been forgotten had there been an ending. The killer finally caught and paraded to the press. Justice served and a real name to finally replace the one bestowed by the tabloids. But there was no ending, and it is vanishingly unlikely that there will be now. No closure or final reckoning with these specific killings from an increasingly distant past. Almost from the moment of his christening, the figure of Bible John had become more than the supposed killer of 3 women who had each spent their last night dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. He had become a legend. I'd long decided that I wanted to end my reporting in Margate, the small and sometimes self-consciously trendy seaside town on the Kent coast. In October 2020, An interview with a local woman named Abigail Dengate had appeared on the Kent Online website. The 38-year-old mother of three had lived at 50 Irvine Drive for 11 years with her children and their grandfather. Of course, she'd known the history and what the house represented, but none of that mattered faced with her own far more pressing needs, having lived in wildly overcrowded accommodation. The fact that Peter Tobin had once lived there didn't bother her, and nor did what had been discovered buried at the end of the narrow little garden. Her family had moved in 2009, and were happy in their home, even 11 years later. The murder house epithet just didn't bother her or her children. They had needed a suitable place to stay, and Thanet Council had been happy to oblige, when it became clear that knocking down the mid-terrace house was too impractical a solution to a fairly unique problem. The previous tenants had almost immediately vacated the property following the discovery of Vicky Hamilton's and Dinah McNichol's remains. I felt that I needed to speak with her, for reasons I barely yet understood. She seemed to encapsulate something about the distinction between the horrors of the past and the often mundane facts of the present. How life didn't always conform to the expectations you might place on it. The sun was starting to set when the train left Peckham Rye Station on Friday the 7th of October 2022. It had been a bright autumn day which held the promise of a cold, crisp night. The Thameslink train to Sevenoaks was still busy with the last of the suburban commuter crowd heading out into the furthest edges of South London and beyond. A couple of visibly exhausted men in paint-splattered work clothes sat at my table, silently sipping at bottles of beer before alighting at Bellingham. To my right, an excitable boy still clad in his school uniform was explaining his week to his smiling mother in exhaustive and rapid-fire detail. At Bromley South, I scooped up my overnight bag and crossed the station to platform 4, where the train to Margate was already loitering. The hour-and-a-half journey passed peacefully enough, as I busied myself with the notes on my laptop, before staring out at the darkened fields which melted past, and briefly merged with a succession of small Kent towns, illuminated by soft yellow streetlights and the occasional flickering pub sign. It had just gone 8:30 when the train finally pulled into an almost deserted Margate station. The streets were quiet save for a few lone walkers, hurrying towards or away from the town centre. Dreamland, the vast modern seaside amusement park, looked tired and off-season, empty, despite its glaringly vivid neon logo lit up against the darkness. The beach was already entirely shrouded by the night, the sea only visible as a steady shifting mass, slightly inkier black than the sky. At my High Street Airbnb, I unpacked my laptop and began to read. The quiet was almost total save for a couple of muffled closing-hour arguments that drifted in through the window from the takeaway over the road. I read from the start, right through from February 1968, with the discovery of Patricia Docker's body in the suburban lane a few hundred yards from her home. I read again about the failures of the subsequent police inquiry, and the fact of her name slowly drifting from the papers. Just another woman killed before gradually fading out of the public eye. The limits of attention set against the perpetual multiplication of horrors, day in, day out, until her name was relegated to the list of all the other unsolved murders that had begun to gather dust on the desks of the city's detectives. The nurse had been used, right up until she wasn't. Right up until the trail behind her had frozen, and there was nothing new for the press to write or report on. I thought about her son, the little boy fleetingly referenced in contemporary news reports, who had lived and grown up with his father and stepmother. His mother hadn't died. She was killed, though her murder wasn't destined to remain shrouded in obscurity like the other women who found their likenesses pinned to the unsolved board across 1968. I looked across the surviving publicly accessible photos of Patricia Docker and reread the brief testimony of her son, talking at various points across the decades in short and unsparing sentences, which were always moving and devoid of any trace of self-pity. I tried and failed again to comprehend even some of what it must have meant to grow up under the shadow of a murdered mother. It was around 18 months later when Jemima MacDonald was found in the miserable tenement, yards from the home she had shared with her children. How the same story had played out in the aftermath of her killing, marked by the same public police appeals for witnesses and information. How it had briefly commanded the tabloids before dropping down the running order and out of the papers entirely. MacDonald was just another woman who had taken her life in her own hands. It was subtly implied from the start. She had been a regular at the notorious Over-25s night at the Barrowland, and everyone knew what sort of people those Thursdays catered to. The murder of the single mother of 3 was sad and shocking, but it didn't remain news any longer than Patricia Docker's had, though the two were eventually causally linked by a few reporters and media-friendly detectives. They had both been at the Barrowland and had both been strangled to death, though that's as far as it went, until Helen Puttick was found by the dog walker in Scotstoun on 1st of November 1969, down the street from where she'd lived with her children and often absent soldier husband. I thought about what it meant to bring Jemima MacDonald into focus yet again, trying to add fresh detail to the flat and threadbare portrait that had emerged over the decades. Was it in honour of her memory, or could another motive be lying somewhere beneath the surface? Of the 3 families, none had been as explicit in their condemnation of the cottage industry that had developed around Bible John. They had never wanted anything much to do with the speculation or the endless adaptations of their grief. It doesn't really matter what the author's intention might be, or what the work sought to achieve. All they desired was that their mother's and aunt's and sister's murder would stay out of the media and for her memory to finally be allowed to settle into the past. And here I was, yet another writer dredging up half a century of memories and pain. What did it mean, even now, to bring someone's life back into view, when their descendants wanted nothing more or less than privacy? Surely there is the right to be forgotten, whatever the weight of public fascination or revulsion that surrounded the killing. I thought of the scorn I'd felt at the contemporary news reports and their occasional misogyny, as well as the carelessness of their assumptions. Crime sold, as Arnott McWhinney told me straightforwardly over the phone, just as well then as it did today. Maybe the question of motive was simpler then. There were papers to sell and a ready-made audience to engage. The city was your lifeblood, and Bible John was a quick guarantee of its attention. To blame the papers for the hysteria would be like blaming the scorpion for its nature. Reporters understood their assignment and precisely what the job entailed. Bible John was like few things that had gone before, though it helped set the template for so much of the crime coverage that was to come in Glasgow and beyond. And the longer that the apparent serial killer stayed uncaught, the more opportunities presented themselves, as each decade threw up its own prime suspect to be pored over and scrutinised, from the beleaguered expat David Henderson in the 1980s, through to the John McInnes fiasco in the mid-1990s. Legends are supposed to have their heroes, but Bible John never really had one to set against the vividly painted folk devil. The story was always too murky and complex, too fevered and weird to have space for any avenging angels. Joe Beatty was never that figure. however strenuously he tried to cast himself in the role. It is not an accident that the former detective superintendent has stayed synonymous with the murders. From late 1969 onwards, he had bound himself tightly to the developing saga, far beyond any reasonable justification. There is the temptation towards pity for a figure who was consumed by the legend and who did so much to stoke its formation. One imagines the hangdog, tweed-suited detective down at his Marine Division fiefdom in Partick, pouring through the terrible mass of files and photographs until the early hours, drowning slowly under the weight of his burden. One can almost feel the rising dread and anxiety as it must have become apparent, even to his strongest and most committed supporters, and perhaps even to the man himself, that none of the press appeals or desperate curveball tactics was going to take them to the killer. And one wonders if the obsession ever really abated, long after his retirement to a life alternating between comfort and ill health in Bear's Den, before his death in 2000, aged 82. The news reports and occasional interviews over the years don't give the impression of a man who could ever let the spectre go. Though by the time of McInnes's exhumation in 1996, he had decided that he had never believed in the existence of a serial killer after all. I thought about Helen Puttick and the family she had left behind. George Puttick, now old and frail, though still occasionally active in the media, responding to the latest stories and updates, still closely guarding his own corner of the narrative. As of 2021, he had told the Daily Record that he had never believed in the idea of a serial killer either, though that isn't what is borne out by his previous appearances in the press. Perhaps none of this really mattered. I thought about what Helen Puttick's murder had done to his family, how his eldest son David was now in his late 50s and had built a life in Canada, though had still consented to a spring 2022 interview in the Daily Record, pleading with Police Scotland to do something, anything, to finally solve the story of his mother's murder. His father, he told the paper, deserved that at least. Earlier, 2020 had seen the death of his younger brother Michael, who, George Puttick told the press, had never managed to come to terms with the facts of his mother's death. There had been a time, in fact, as a young boy, when he had accused his own father of being responsible after a school friend had let slip that his mother had been strangled rather than hit by a bus, as George Puttick had told his children. I thought about Jeannie Williams, whose sister had been killed, and the life she must have led in the months and years after their Thursday night out at the Barrowland had long passed into myth. How many times must she have repeated the outline of that night to Joe Beattie and his detectives, until she'd given them the story they wanted, as well as to the countless journalists who had appeared at her door in the decades after, right up until her death in 2010. She was transfigured into a character too, the star witness and grieving sister, who'd come face to face with the killer himself and lived to describe him into legend. As the night drew in, I tried to think again on my own role in reanimating the old murders and dragging them back out for another bout of public re-examination. After all the months that had passed, there was no point in lying to myself. Yes, I'd wanted to give more voice to the women who had died and tried to improve on the thin attention their lives had received. And I'd tried to paint a picture of the time and place that Bible John had arrived in and what the enduring fascination with the killings could or couldn't say about our wider fascination with historic crime or cold cases or whatever other euphemism that might be wrapped around the fact of 3 women murdered in Glasgow between February 1968 and November 1969. Though I had done all of this and much else to try and treat their stories with respect, there was the same shadow that had hung over the undertaking. just as it had at the very beginning of my reporting. The same repelled fascination with the unsolved and probably unsolvable mystery, which made looking away an impossibility. Then there were the predictable, if guilty and involuntary pleasures of discovering a long-forgotten flourish of detail in an old newspaper, or of tracking down a source who might be able to shed light on a contentious point of fact. The professional pride to be taken in any story, whatever the horror at its core. I thought about what this might say and whether any of what I thought really mattered at all. I woke up early the next morning after a disturbed sleep, hazy with nightmares and odd sounds I couldn't quite place, which had come from somewhere just outside the bedroom window. Bold yellow sunlight poured through the blinds as I made some tea and skimmed over the literary magazine I'd packed, before heading out for a brief walk across the beach. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully enough, as I continued to read through my Bible John notes, old and new. By early afternoon, the internet in the flat had packed in, so I took myself to the nearby library to continue with my work. The building was almost empty, save for a group of chattering girls, no older than 11 or 12. They spoke about football and schoolwork and laughed loudly at their own increasingly absurd jokes and giddiness. On the other side of the room sat an elderly man carefully thumbing through a greasy copy of the Financial Times, page by painstaking page. The mood was light and vaguely cosy in its own way. After an hour or so, I set aside my notes and opened a new Word document. At first, I didn't know how to start, or even what it was I was trying to write. It was a letter, yes, but not like one I'd ever tried to compose before. The words just wouldn't come, and when they did, I'd swiftly delete them and begin again. What precisely should, or could, you say to a stranger whose house you wanted to visit because it had once been dug up as the former residence of one of the UK's most notorious serial killers? I decided to try and write down the truth as clearly as possible. Starting with who I was, a writer that had spent the last few years working on a book regarding Bible John, the infamous and uncaught figure from Glasgow's 20th century history. There has been a theory for a number of years now that Peter Tobin was Bible John, I explained, though neither I nor anyone truly credible still believed in the connection, and maybe doubted that the serial killer called Bible John had ever really existed at all. The next request may seem strange, I wrote. There is myth and horror, and then there is the reality of everyday life. You have a family, and needed a place to live, so why should the house's history have impacted on that? I'd added my mobile number and email address, just in case she would be interested in speaking with me at any point, though I totally understood if it sounded too odd or far-fetched for her liking. It wasn't long before I felt a hand on my shoulder after I'd finished setting down my strange request on paper. It was my friend David, a Margate resident who had agreed to pick me up and drive me to the nondescript council house on Irvine Drive that Peter Tobin had called home. I'd explained the nature of the errand, and he'd immediately been only too happy to help, even though he'd have to come straight from his son's 7th birthday party. After returning from the printer, I clocked the look of astonishment and incomprehension spread across David's face. He gestured to his phone screen without a word, which was open to a short article on the BBC website. The news had just come in. Peter Tobin had died earlier the same morning at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, aged 76, unrepentant to the very end. The article explained that police officers had attended the death at 6:04 a.m, while David Swindle had been quoted stating his enduring belief that Tobin had more undiscovered victims and that he had been a figure without any respect for humanity. As we drove the 15 minutes or so to Irvine Drive, my thoughts turned to the practical and professional. The tabloids would be arriving too, though the worst of me knew that we'd already had a significant head start. Soon enough, the bars and restaurants of Cliftonville melted away, and the roads became wider, the front gardens that bit smaller or less ostentatiously well kept. It was just about 3 o'clock, and the afternoon sun was at its peak. We parked up on Irvine Drive and walked past a neat row of identikit 1930s council houses, before arriving at the right door, where I took the folded letter from my bag. The approach to the house suggested a well-loved and lived-in home, with a couple of chairs and potted plants by the front door, while a family of smiling papier-mâché skeletons hung from the porch canopy. Halloween wasn't too far off. The letter slid through the letterbox, and I turned back to face the sunlight before making my way back up the street. David was standing at the bend in the road as I made my way back to him, and picked my pace up to a jog. That was We All Go Into the Dark, The Hunt for Bible John, by Francisco Garcia, read by Angus King, produced by Bridget Lees at Chatterbox Audio, with post-production by Ed Corral and Lisa Roos. An audiobook from Mudlark, an imprint of HarperCollins. Text copyright 2023. Production copyright 2023 by HarperCollins Publishers. All rights reserved. Francisco Garcia asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Thank you for listening.